Introduction to Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in May 2022. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby, a book for little children. Dedication and Introduction. Dedication. To my little friend Caspar, and to my nephews and nieces, this book is lovingly dedicated with the hope that it will show them the beauty of gentleness and lead them with the help of their home fairies to choose the good and refuse the evil until they all become good fairies and make the world brighter and happier by their presence. April 1873. Birdie's Introduction. I fear my little friend Birdie will be frightened at meeting so many children at once, so I will take his hand in mine and help him through the tiresome business of being introducted. I hope you will soon become well acquainted with each other, and then your shy glances will change to loving smiles, and the red lips, now shut so tightly, will unclose for pleasant words and merry laughter, so that you will feel like old friends to Birdie, and make him forget all about his alarm at seeing such a lot of children. Birdie made that remark. He is finding out how to open his lips, you see. Well, Birdie, to begin with the least, you may first speak to the 6 little cousins who are playing so nicely with blocks and a Noah's Ark in this corner. But as they are only babies yet and love to play with toys more than to read books, we cannot stop long to see them just now. For here is a group of little girls who wish to speak to you, Birdie. Little girls who love to read or hear storybooks, and who will, I think, be pleased with the stories we are going to tell them. See, when they stand in a row, they make a regular set of steps, beginning with little May's curly head and going up to tall Carrie's smooth locks. What do you say, Birdie? You don't think they look much like the stairs? Well, they don't look very much like them, it is true, for stairs have not such round, rosy cheeks and bright eyes, nor such plump, soft hands, ready to take yours and welcome you so warmly to their homes. Ah, they must know that you have something pleasant to tell them, and they are trying to drive away all your shyness by their kind greeting, as good little girls always do. They shall each have a kiss and a smile, but they cannot coax us to tell them our secret just yet, can they, Birdie? For next you must speak to the boys a few minutes. You need not be afraid or hold my hand so tightly, for they are glad to see you and will be very kind to you, although all but 2 are such big fellows. Why, Birdie, you ought to say large boys, my dear. It is not very long since they were just your size, and they have heard of you occasionally, and will show you that they can treat their little visitor politely, I am sure. But we cannot stop to talk so much, for we have a great deal to do today, and have come on purpose to show you all. Now for the secret, a new book, just brought from the printer and bookbinder. And who do you think it tells about? Why, our little friend Birdie, and his wonderful adventures with the fairies, and some other events in his short but happy life. Ah, he has run off to play with the little ones, but while he is away I can tell you something more about him, for he is a shy little rogue, and does not like to be looked at. Birdie is a great friend of mine. I love him for his bright blue eyes, rosy cheeks, and dimpled smile, but still more because he is generally very good and gentle, and I think that is the reason the fairies love him and come to see him sometimes. Birdie lives in a cozy little cottage in the country, with a porch in front, almost covered with roses and vines, while the large trees around the house shade it and keep it cool all day. On one side of the house there is a pretty garden filled with lovely flowers and small fruit trees and bushes, and when the flowers are all in bloom and the fruit is ripe, The garden is a very pleasant place to play in. Then there is an apple orchard beyond the garden, and still farther on there are the woods, where Birdie loves to pick wildflowers, and a pretty stream to sail boats in runs through the meadow among old trees, so that Birdie has many nice places to play in, although he has not many playmates, except his kitten and his fairy friends, whose stories are told in this book. Well, in this cottage Birdie has lived with his kind parents and good old Nancy and Thomas ever since he can remember. But hush! Here he comes, acting pony for little Casper, who has tied a pair of reins and some sleigh bells around Birdie's waist and seems very well pleased with his merry playmate. Now, dear children, come close around us and be very quiet and attentive while Birdie shows you the pretty pictures and I read to you about his adventures with the fairies, beginning with a happy day Birdie spent one summer with the Rose Fairies. End of introduction. Section 1 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in June 2022. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. The Rose Fairies. One pleasant morning, little Birdie might have been seen sitting quietly on the grass plat at the side of his mother's house, looking very earnestly at the rose bushes. It was quite early. Great Mr. Sun, who is such an early riser in summer-time, had not been up very long. The birds were just beginning to chirp their good mornings to each other, and as for the flowers, they were still asleep. But Birdie was so busy all day trotting about the house and garden that he was always ready for his nest at night before the birds and flowers had thought of seeking theirs. And so it came to pass that when Mr. Sun raised his head above the green woods and smiled lovingly upon the earth, Birdie was often the first to see him and to smile back at him, all the while rubbing his eyes with his dimpled fists, until between smiling and rubbing he was wide awake. And what do you think he did next? Why, the little rogue rolled into his mamma's bed and kissed her eyelids, her cheeks, and her mouth until she began to dream that it was raining kisses. And at last she opened her eyes to see what it all meant and found that it was Birdie trying to kiss her awake, as he said. She loved her little boy very dearly and liked to make him happy, and when he said, "Please dress me, dear mamma, and let me go out to play in the garden," she cheerfully consented, and soon after Birdie went downstairs in his morning dress of cool linen and with his round face bright and rosy from its bath, and ran out on the gravel path to play until breakfast was ready. He stood still a moment to look about him and think what he should do first. The fresh morning air blew softly in his face as if to welcome him and be his merry playmate, and the bright eye of Mr. Sun looked at him with a warm and glowing smile. But Birdie soon walked on to find something to play with. As he came in sight of the rose bushes that grew near the side of the house, he suddenly clapped his hands and with a little shout of joy stopped to look at them. They were all covered with lovely rosebuds. Some were red, some white, and others pale pink, and they were just peeping out of the green leaves, as rosy-faced children peep out from under their warm beds in winter-time, before they are quite willing to get up. A few days before, Birdie's papa had told him that the green balls on the rose bushes had beautiful flowers shut up within them. But the little boy found it hard to believe, for he was so young that he did not remember how pretty the roses had been the summer before. Now he found out that his father's words were true, for a few days of warm weather had turned the green balls into rosebuds. and they were so beautiful that it was enough to make Birdie stand still before them, his blue eyes dancing with delight, and his little hands clasped tightly together. After a while he went nearer, and looking closely at the buds, found that they were folded up leaf over leaf, as eyelids are folded over sleeping eyes, so that Birdie thought they must be asleep. "Lazy roses, wake up," said he, giving the branches a gentle shake, but only the dew fell off the bright drops, and the flowers were still shut up. At last Birdie remembered how he had awakened his mother with kisses, and thought he would try the same plan with the roses. So he drew up his red lips until they looked like a rosebud too, and bending down a branch with a lovely pink bud upon it, he kissed it softly 2 or 3 times. And what do you think happened then? Something very wonderful indeed. As the little boy took his hand from the branch, it flew back to its place. The pink rosebud slowly unfolded its leaves one by one, and in the midst of it there seemed to be a beautiful little fairy, a lovely little fairy lady dressed in pink silk, with a wreath of tiny pink roses on her head. There she sat in the midst of the rows, bowing and nodding and smiling at Birdie, as if to thank him for his kindness in letting her out of her green prison into the warm air and bright sunshine of the morning. The graceful little creature soon began dancing and swaying on the slender bough, as if she were in a swing, while her beautiful robes fluttered in the breeze, and she looked so light and airy that Birdie thought she would fly away, and was afraid to look around lest he should lose sight of his wonderful new playmate. But when at last he glanced at the other buds, he could hardly believe his own eyes, for he saw that nearly all had opened, and that in each one stood a little fairy, just like the first he had discovered, except that some wore dresses of red silk with wreaths of tiny red roses in their hair, and others were in pure white with white wreaths. Was not that a wonderful and beautiful sight for a little boy to see? Indeed it was, and Birdie was so astonished to find himself surrounded by fairies that he drew back in his surprise, still keeping his eyes upon the rose bushes, and never thinking where he was going until he suddenly tripped against the edge of the grass plat and sat down plump on the soft grassy bank. There he sat perfectly still for a long time, with his hands on his knees and his eyes wide open, watching the dainty rose fairies as they danced and swayed about on the graceful sprays of the rose trees, nodding and smiling and waving their hands, while their bright dresses fluttered in the breeze, and their sweet breath seemed to fill the garden. Birdie was delighted with his lovely little friends, but felt afraid to move, lest he should frighten them away. And so he sat very still, looking at them so long and steadily that at last he could hardly tell which were fairies and which were roses. He did not hear the ringing of the breakfast bell, nor did he once think of being hungry. But after a while he heard a step on the path, and looking up saw his mother coming to find him. "Oh, mamma!" he exclaimed earnestly, though in a low tone. "Don't say anything. Please don't come here. You will frighten them all away," he added, as his mother came nearer to see what he was doing. Then, looking back at the roses and not seeing the fairies any more, he ran to his mamma with his eyes full of tears and said, "Oh dear, they're all gone. I thought they were afraid of big people. Oh, I'm so sorry." The tears rolled over his cheeks as he spoke. Although his mother could not quite understand the cause of his grief, she did not reprove him, for she knew that little children have their troubles and sorrows as well as grown persons. So she took him up in her arms and tried to comfort him with loving words as they went in to breakfast. Poor Birdie said he could not eat anything, but when he saw the nice bowl of bread and milk waiting for him, with his own little spoon standing in it, he concluded to taste it. And after that it was not long before every drop of bread and milk was gone, and the bowl stood empty with only a spoon in it. Birdie's mamma said when she saw it, "Why, that looks like the little wee bear's bowl of porridge, after Goldenhair had tasted it and found that it was neither too hot nor too cold, but just right." This made Birdie laugh, for he knew the story of the 3 bears very well. Then his mother said, "What did my little boy see in the rose bushes to keep him quiet so long?" And Birdie told her, as well as he could, about the beautiful little fairies that danced on the roses and seemed to be nodding and smiling at him, and that he was trying to keep very quiet, his way of saying very quiet, lest he should frighten them all away. "But they flew away when you came, Mamma, and I 'spect I'll never see 'em any more," he concluded sadly, while the tears nearly rolled over again. His kind mother soon thought of a way to comfort him, for she told him cheerfully that although the fairies seemed to be afraid of big people, she thought they would not go far away from her garden, where they had so many sweet roses to sleep in at night, and such a gentle little boy to play with in the daytime. "Perhaps, Birdie," continued his mother, "the pretty little rose fairies have taken the shape of butterflies and moths, or even honeybees, so that they can fly about all day, from flower to flower, without being noticed by grown-up persons or naughty boys who might hurt them. You can run out in the garden now, dear, and see if you cannot find some fairies in that shape." This thought pleased Birdie very much, and kissing his mamma good-bye as she tied on his straw hat, he hurried out to the garden to look for his fairy friends. Do you think he found them? I think so, for the roses were full of pretty white moths and beautiful butterflies with red wings, and they fluttered and danced about in and out among the roses, very much as the fairies had done, so that Birdie felt sure that his mother was right and that the fairies had not left his garden. He spent the day very happily, watching the pretty butterflies and running about to keep them in sight as they flew from one sweet flower to another. He did not try to catch them or make any noise to frighten them, for he loved the happy little things and would not have hurt them for all the world, and they were not afraid of Birdie, but came close to him sometimes and flew around him merrily, and one little young moth even lit on his cheek for a moment, taking it for a rose, perhaps, it was so smooth and red. As Birdie was so gentle and loving, the fairies, or butterflies, soon learned to love him, and stayed in the garden all day playing with the good little boy, and leading him a merry chase through the grounds until at last he was so tired that he dropped asleep on the grass, before the fairies had gone back to their beds in the soft roses. His papa carried him upstairs to his little crib, and thus ended Birdie's day with the Rose Fairies. End of Section 1. The Rose Fairies.
Section 2 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret T. Canby. Section 2. The Sunbeam Fairies. It was a warm, sunny morning in spring when our little friend Birdie begged his mother to take a walk in the woods to see if the wildflowers were awake yet. His mother was willing to go, but said that Birdie would have to wait a little while, as she had something to attend to before she could go. It was hard for such a little boy to wait patiently, but he thought the time would not seem so long if he was busy. So he began putting his toy closet in order, and soon became so much interested that he was quite surprised when his mother came in, all ready for their walk. She looked at his closet and told him he was a good boy to put his playthings in such nice order, and then said, "You have been so quiet and patient, Birdie, that I had time to make some cakes, and we will take a few with us to eat on the way." Birdie then put on his hat, and his mamma gave him a little basket to carry. saying as they went out of the front gate, "We will go to the barn first and give Papa some cakes." "Oh, yes, let's!" cried Birdie, with such a hop, skip, and jump that the cakes rattled in the basket as if they were jumping too, and his mother said, "Take care, my boy. If you let the cakes hop out into the mud, they will look like the mud pies you make sometimes." This made Birdie laugh and take his mother's hand, saying, "I'll be quiet now, Mama, but I'm so happy I'd like to fly." By this time they had reached the big gate, which led into the barnyard, and as they went in, Alice, the pretty colt, came running to meet them, neighing and tossing her mane. Birdie felt a little afraid and drew back, but his mother said, "Alice is glad to see us again. Come and give her a cake, dear." The colt was quiet now, bending down her head to be stroked and patted, and when Birdie held out a cake, she took it gently from his hand and began eating it as if she thought it very good, nodding her head as if to thank him. They left Alice looking over the gate and went on to the barn, where they found Birdie's father at work. He called out, "Who comes here?" "A grenadier," answered Birdie, trying to look tall as he marched in with the basket on his arm. "And what have you brought me? A pot of beer?" asked his father. "Something better than that," said his mother. "We have brought you some nice fresh cakes for lunch. And we are going to the woods to look for flowers and to eat cakes on the way. And I most made mud pies out of the cakes, and I gave Alice one," said Birdie, almost out of breath, when he had finished his speech, which was somewhat of a jumble. "Why, young man, you have quite a lot of news to tell me," said his father, laughing. "I should like to go with you to call on the flowers, but I am too busy, so you must bring some back for me." "Yes, we will, Papa," said the child, and then, bidding good-bye with a kiss, he and his mother started again for the woods. They went down the road a short distance and then turned into the apple orchard. Birdie's quick eye soon caught sight of the flowers on the trees, and he exclaimed, "Oh, Mama, just look at those little roses. How did they get way up on the trees?" "They are apple blossoms, dear, not roses," said she, and pulling down a branch, she picked a spray for the little boy to look at. The buds were round and pink, almost like little berries, but the open flowers were pink outside and white within. Birdie was delighted with them and wanted to pick a whole lot to take to Papa. But his mother told him if the blossoms were taken off, the bright red apples would not grow, but that he should gather in the woods as many flowers as he chose. And Birdie did not ask again for the apple blossoms, as he thought his mother knew best. As they went on, they saw the pretty bluebirds flying from tree to tree, and they heard a robin whistling merrily. Once they saw a little squirrel run along the top of the fence and sit still for a moment on a post to look around. But as soon as it saw them, it was off like a flash. When they reached the fence, they found some of the bars down and went through into the woods, and after scrambling over some stones and briars, they came out on a grassy hillside, with tall trees growing on it, and the bright sun streaming through the branches, not yet in their summer dress of green leaves. "Now look, Birdie," said his mother, as they stood still under the trees. And well might he look about him, silent with wonder and delight, his rosy face dimpling with smiles at the beautiful sight before him. The ground was covered with wildflowers. They peeped up at his feet, grew in rings around the trees, clustered together in the grass, and seemed to be everywhere. It was such a warm, sunny spot that all the spring flowers grew there. Bunches of blue innocents, delicate white windflowers, and pale anemones nodded above the dry leaves. The snowy blossoms of the bloodroot and the dainty striped spring beauty were side by side, while now and then some early violets looked out from among their green leaves, or a bright yellow strawberry blossom peeped up, smiling. "You see, the sunshine has awakened all the flowers, Birdie," said his mother, when they had looked at them for some time without speaking. "Yes, indeed," said the child, "and such a many! I didn't know there were so many flowers in the world." "Ah, my boy," replied the mother, "there are many beautiful things in the world, and I hope you will always try to see and praise them, that others may learn to love them." "I do love the pretty flowers, Mamma, but I'd like to pick a few," said Birdie. "Will it hurt 'em if I take some home to Papa? 'Cause I said I would," he continued, looking up earnestly into his mother's face. "No, darling, it will not hurt them," his mother answered. "You know I said you might gather as many as you wanted in the woods." "Oh, that's good!" exclaimed the little boy, and then he sprang forward and was soon in the midst of the sweet flowers, carefully picking some of each kind, and often running to show them to his mother, who was resting on a log. At last he came to her with a bunch of violets and spring beauties in his hand, and said, "Just look at these lovelies, Mamma. Now I think I have mostly enough for Papa," and seemed, after his merry ramble, quite ready to sit down and rest while they finished the cakes. His mamma put the flowers into the little basket, telling Birdie they would not fade so quickly there as if he carried them, and while she was arranging them, she said, "Everything seems to be waking from its long winter sleep today, and all look bright and happy, as if to thank God for taking care of them so kindly through the cold days." "Yes, and we're happy too," said Birdie, "and when I say my prayers tonight, I'm going to say thank you to God for all these pretty flowers." His mother patted his wise little head and said that was right, and then Birdie, who was never quiet very long, said, "Did you ever go out in the woods and pick flowers when you were a little boy, Mamma?" "When I was a little girl, I did," answered his mother with a smile. "Many a happy day have I spent in the woods, and once I thought I saw some fairies there." "Oh, do tell me about it, Mamma dear, just a little while we rest here. It would be so nice," said the little boy, his eyes dancing with delight at the thought of hearing a fairy tale. "We must go soon, dear," answered his mother, "but perhaps we'll have time for a short story, and then we shall have to go home." "Yes'm, we will," said Birdie, "as soon as you get done the story." "Well," said his mamma, "when I was a little girl, I went out in the woods one fine spring day to look for flowers." "All by yourself?" asked Birdie. "No, my brothers were with me. We were going to take up some flower roots to put in our little gardens at home. The boys had small spades and baskets to carry the plants in, and what do you think I took?" "Some cakes, I guess," said Birdie, who was still busy with his lunch. "No, pet," said his mother, "I took a bag to put nuts in. My brothers laughed at me and said the squirrels had carried off all the nuts by that time, but I said I knew I could find some, and I would take the bag." "Did you get any nuts in it?" asked Birdie. "You shall hear, little chatterbox, if you will be quiet," said his mamma, beginning again. "When we reached the woods, we were delighted to find the ground covered with flowers in full bloom, and we picked some bunches to take home to our mother, and then the boys said they would go to work and dig up roots. 'You go look for your nuts, Bessie,' they said to me, 'and if your bag gets so full you can't lift it, call us to help you.' I ran off in a hurry, for I did not like to be teased, and when I came to the old chestnut tree where we had gathered nuts in the autumn, I went to work very busily. I took a stick and turned over the burrs and knocked some open to find the nuts. But after looking all around the tree and getting very tired and hot, and pricking my fingers with the burrs without finding a single good nut, I began to think my brothers were right and that the squirrels had taken all the nuts. "Naughty squirrels!" exclaimed Birdie, "to take all the nuts away from poor little mamma." "Oh, that is all they have for food, dear," answered his mother. But I did not know it then, and felt almost ready to cry, and sat down on a rock, looking very cross, I'm afraid. I wondered why nuts did not last all the year, and whether any more would grow on the tree. And that made me look up into the tall tree, stretching its great branches far above my head, and through the boughs I saw the blue sky, looking so smiling that I felt ashamed of my cross feelings and said aloud, "I'm going to be happy and good if I can't find nuts." After that I felt much better and looked about me at the trees and bushes, and then at the little flowers growing amid the grass, and I was surprised to see how beautiful and bright everything seemed to me. Do you know why it was, Birdie? "No, Mamma, why?" said the little boy. "Because I was good-natured then and felt bright and happy. That was the reason I could see the beauty of the sweet spring flowers, which I hardly noticed when I was giving way to ill temper. I wondered who had planted all those lovely flowers and who took care of them. And then I thought of the fairies and said to myself, I do believe they are the fairies' flowers." Just then I heard a little rustling not far off, and on looking around, what should I see but a troop of tiny fairies flying through the wood. Some wore long floating robes of pure white, others wore robes of blue or pale pink, and some had cloaks of green that seemed to be made of leaves. But all had wings of shining gold, so fine and thin I could almost see through them, and yet they seemed strong, for the fairies flew about very quickly and fluttered their wings in the sunlight until I was almost dazzled with their brightness. They did not notice me at all, and I sat there on the rock with my head resting on my hand, hardly daring to breathe, lest I should frighten them away before I could see what they were doing. Very busy and active were the little creatures. They flew about among the flowers and worked as hard as they could at their pleasant task. Some pulled the dead leaves away from the young plants and carried off the dry twigs and sticks that had blown down in the winter. But the fairies were so small that it took 2 or 3 to carry off an oak leaf, and a dozen of them could hardly lift some of the sticks. Some tried to loosen the earth around the flower roots and brought water in their tiny leaf buckets to pour upon the plants. Others fluttered over the sleeping flowers, fanning them with their glittering wings and singing, "Idle flowerets, open your eyes, the Sunbeam Fairies bid you to rise." As they sang, the flowers seemed to spring up at their call and to throw back their green hoods, lifting up their lovely faces to meet the bright smiles of their fairy friends, who would bend down to kiss them and then go floating away through the wood to awaken more blossoms into life and beauty. I heard no cross words and saw no frowning looks, but all were gentle and happy, and went singing on their way, seeming to know their duty and to rejoice in doing it. I watched them for a long time and felt as if I should never tire of seeing those pretty little creatures tending the flowers. But at last I was startled by feeling a hand on my shoulder, and then my brother's voice said, "Why, Bessie, I believe you have been asleep in the warm sunshine, just like a little pussy-cat." I jumped up and rubbed my eyes, looking around for the fairies as I answered pleasantly, "No, indeed, brother. I've been watching the sweetest little fairies, and I'm so sorry they have gone away before you saw them." But my brother laughed and said, "Oh, you've been dreaming, Bessie. I did not see any fairies, and I came up very quietly." I could see no sign of my bright friends then either, but I concluded they had flown away to another part of the wood. However, I made up my mind to be good-natured and only said, "Well, I've had a lovely time anyhow," and then we went home. My brothers saw that I did not mind their fun and teasing, so they did not say much about my nuts, though they saw by the empty bag hanging over my arm that I had not found any. As soon as we reached home, I ran to the nursery, where my mother was, and told her all about the fairies as well as I could. She did not laugh at me, but said it must have been a beautiful sight, and she would like to see it too. Then she said, "I hope you have brought a Sunbeam Fairy home with you, my child." "Why, I could not, Mother," said I. "They would not let me touch them, and as soon as the boys spoke to me, they flew away as quick as lightning." My mother smiled and said, "I think you have brought me a Sunbeam Fairy for all that, my darling." And then she drew me close to her and said, "My little daughter looked rather gloomy and frowning as she left home, but as she came back so bright and smiling that I think the fairies must have charmed away all the clouds. You must try always to copy your little friends and shed smiles like sunshine on all around you." Then she read me a funny little story, which amused me very much. Perhaps I will read it to you, Birdie, sometime. And after this pleasant hour with my kind mother, I determined to try always to be happy and cheerful. And whenever I felt inclined to be cross or fretful, I would think of the Sunbeam Fairies and try to be like them. "And so you are, dear mamma," exclaimed Birdie earnestly. "Your eyes always look sunshiny to me." "And to me, too," said a deep voice behind them, which came so suddenly that it made Birdie start and tumble off the log he had been sitting on. But he fell on the soft grass and rolled over, laughing to see who it was, when he found out that his father had come to look for them, as it was nearly time for dinner. "This little rogue coaxed me into telling him a story," said the mother, "and so we have stayed too long in the woods." Then Birdie gave the basket of flowers to his father, who said they were very pretty. Then, tossing the little boy up on his shoulder, they went home through the apple orchard, where the flowers were blooming and the birds singing. Birdie's head was as high as some of the branches, and his mother said his rosy face looked like a bright red apple with a straw hat on. So they had a merry walk and soon reached home. End of section 2. Section 3 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret T. Canby. Section 3. Little Crosspatch. Part 2nd. That evening, after Birdie had taken a little nap on the lounge to rest from his long walk, and had eaten his supper very quietly and thoughtfully, he drew his small armchair close to his mother's side, and looking up with a smile, said, "Don't you 'member, Mamma?" "Remember what, darling?" inquired his mother, wondering what the child could mean. "Why, about that funny story you were going to read me sometime. Isn't it sometime now, Mamma?" "For I'd like to hear it, for you forget about it," he answered, in such a pleading voice that his father laughed and said, "You might as well tell that story, Mamma, for someone else will 'member about it if you don't." "I should like to hear it too, and I'll be very quiet and not interrupt you once if you will read it to us." Then Birdie's eyes danced with delight, for he knew that his father was agreeing with him, although he did ask in such a queer way. The mother said she had not intended to read a piece of nonsense to such a large boy, but as he had made such promises of good behavior, she would indulge him this time, having no doubt that he would beg leave to be absent from the next reading. Then she went to her writing desk, and taking out a folded paper, she sat down near the light and began to read the story of Little Crosspatch. There was a little maiden who sat beneath the trees and heard the blackbirds chirping and the buzzing of the bees, and yet this little Crosspatch did nothing else but cry. There came a gentle bluebird, and singing sweet and low, he said, "My little darling, don't cry and whimper so." But the silly little Crosspatch did nothing else but cry. There came a yellow bumblebee, a bumblebee of sighs, who said, "My lovely maiden, do wipe your weeping eyes." But still the little Crosspatch did nothing else but cry. Then came an ugly crow bird, as black as night that crow, and said, "Oh, naughty maiden, with me you'll have to go. There's no use saying no, for you really have to go. And learn, my little Crosspatch, to do better things than cry." He took her by the apron strings and sailed her through the air, and right into a crow's nest he plumped her fair and square, and silly little Crosspatch was too frightened then to cry. Then on the little crow birds she had to wait all day, and find for them the restless moth and active flies of May, and busy little Crosspatch found then no time to cry. At last she grew so gentle, as good as she could be, and curtsied, smiling sweetly, to each creature she did see. So no one called her Crosspatch, or ever heard her cry. Then Crow took up her apron strings and sailed her through the air, and right into her own dear home he plumped her fair and square, and her mother found that Crosspatch had forgotten how to cry. This funny little song amused Birdie, and he had so many questions to ask about the little crows and their nest, and at last decided that it wouldn't be a bit nice to be treated like poor little Crosspatch. "You must be very good and quiet, then, Birdie," said his mother, "and never cry or scream when you get hurt, for fear Mr. Crow should hear you and take you sailing through the air." "Come and see what I am doing, my man," said his father, who had been drawing something at the other side of the table. Birdie soon climbed upon a chair beside his father, and saw a picture of a rough crow's nest in the branches of a tree, with 3 or 4 hungry-looking young crows in it. On a branch above the nest sat the mother, or Mrs. Crow, while on a still higher branch sat old Mr. Crow, bending over, as if just ready to pounce down upon little Crosspatch and carry her up to his nest to wait on his troublesome children. Birdie studied the picture very earnestly and said at last, "I suppose the little girl that cried so is down at the foot of that tree." "Yes," said his father, and old Mr. Crow came whirring down, flapping his wings and saying, "Caw, caw, caw," and seized her by the apron, just so, and down came a hand on Birdie's back so suddenly that he screamed with surprise and then laughed merrily at his papa, pretending to be old Mr. Crow. End of section 3.
Section number 4 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by JoBeth McKee. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. Birdie's Garden. Ever since Birdie's walk in the woods, when his mother had told him of her little garden, He had been wishing to have one for himself. His mother promised to give him a piece of ground and help him plant it with flowers as soon as the weather became warm and dry enough for him to be out of doors all day. It seemed a long time to our little friend before the rain stopped falling and the dark clouds blowing over the sky, and he sometimes said, "Summer will never come." But at last the warm sunshine greeted him day after day, the grass began to turn green, and summer had really come. Then his mother said to him early one morning, "Now is the time for your garden, my boy. You have been quite patient and deserve to be rewarded. Let me tie on your broad straw hat, and then you can take your wheelbarrow out on the path while I get a trowel and we will go to work." No sooner said than done, for Birdie was ready in a moment and was trundling out of his wheelbarrow before his mother could turn around. But he did not mind waiting out of doors, where all was so bright and pleasant. He picked some dandelions and wild violets out of the grass, and then went to the poultry yard to take a look at the hens and the chickens, and had almost forgotten his garden when he heard his mother calling him. He ran to her and found her waiting at the back door with her garden hat and gloves. "Forward march," said she, and Birdie seized his wheelbarrow and followed her. They went down the wide gravel walk that ran through the garden, bordered on each side by flower beds. Some of the plants were covered with flowers. The rosebuds were beginning to open, and the lilacs nodded their sweet purple blossoms above, while heart's ease and mignonette were blooming near the ground. Birdie said he hoped his flowers would be as pretty, and his mother said she thought they would if he took good care of them. Near the end of the garden, a narrow path crossed the middle one, and here the mother turned and stopped before a border that had been freshly dug, saying, "This is to be your garden, dear. Now we must plant it full of flowers or vegetables. Which do you want?" He thought for a moment, and then he said, "I want half for flowers, Mama, and all the rest for things to eat. But I don't believe vegetables will grow in such a little place. Do you, Mama?" His mother smiled and said, "Things to eat are called vegetables, dear. If you wish to plant half of your ground with them, Thomas must make a little path in the middle of this border, and you can walk on it and plant your flowers and seeds." Birdie was pleased with this plan, and his mother sent him to find the gardener and ask him to bring his spade and make a path. Thomas soon came, and Birdie said he would stay and help him while his mother cut some flowers for the parlor. So he brought his wheelbarrow and picked up all the sticks and stones that Thomas threw out of the ground. And when he had gathered up a few, he would take them to a pile of rubbish and empty them, calling out at the end of each trip, "I'm helping Thomas." The path was soon made, and Birdie was much pleased with it. And after trotting up and down it several times to try it, he ran to his mother and said, "Now, Mama, can't I have a rose bush in my garden, all full of roses and some tulips and violets and lots of pretty flowers?" His mother smiled rather sadly as she pushed back the hair from his warm face and said, "We should have to get the fairies to help us, dear child, if you want your garden to bloom in one day. But we can move some plants into it, and I will give you some seeds, and in a few weeks you will have lots of pretty flowers in your garden." This was a new idea to little Birdie, who thought one day's work would turn his border into a blooming flower bed, and whose gardening had always been on a plan of his own, and consisted of sticking flowers into the ground by their stems, which answered well for a day, but would hardly make a handsome garden by the end of summer, as without roots they soon withered away and died. He looked down and was quiet so long that his mamma said, "Never mind, dear, the time will soon pass by, if you are busy and good." thinking he was grieving over his long waiting. But the little boy looked up very cheerfully and said, "I wonder where the fairies live, Mamma. For if I knew where to find them, I could go and beg them very hard and give them my new picture book, and then I'm most sure they would make my flowers grow." His mother sat down on a garden chair and, taking Birdie on her knee, said, "Mamma knows of some fairies who will help you, even without the new picture book. One is called Patience, who likes to live in our hearts, if naughty impatience does not drive it out. If you will let Patience live in your heart, my child, and wait until our Father in heaven sends the dew and the sunshine to awaken your flowers, you will soon see them growing and blooming. Then there is a fairy called Love, a heart fairy like Patience, who is always watching to make good children happy. Perhaps it will find out a way to help you. But now we must go to work and see what we can do for ourselves, for we cannot expect help unless we do our share." Birdie listened attentively to his dear mamma's kind words, and then she put him down with a kiss and a loving smile, which went right to his heart like a sunbeam, and drove away all disappointment. He watched and tried to help her as she took up carefully with her trowel 2 or 3 small rose bushes, leaving plenty of earth around the tender roots, and placed them in the little wheelbarrow, which Birdie wheeled slowly to his new garden when full. They planted them near the fence at the back of the border, and then went for another load of plants. In this way they moved some violets and daisies, some yellow cowslips, and some Johnny Jumpers, as Birdie called them. And when all this was done, the garden was quite full of plants. Birdie's kind mother then gave him flower seeds, and showing him how to plant them, she said, "Now after a day or two, the warm rain will awaken the little plants, and they will send their tiny roots creeping into the soft earth to find food. And then the tender leaves will come peeping up to find the sunshine, and so they will grow and bear flowers." "But Mamma," said Birdie, "I planted some seeds last summer, and I dug them up the next day to see if they were growing, and they never growed at all." His mother smiled and said, "Oh, you must not dig them up, my child. That was impatience at work. You must let them alone until they are ready to come up. How would you like me to pull you out of your bed at night to see if you were asleep or awake?" Birdie laughed at this and said, "I will not dig them up this time." So his mother left him at work and went into the house to put flowers in water. Before long she heard a pair of little feet come pattering through the hall and go trotting up the stairs, and then come down again and go out to the garden. She followed quietly to see what the little boy was doing, and got there just in time to see him putting an old pair of her slippers into a hole that he had dug. "Why, what are you doing, Birdie?" said his mother so suddenly that he started, and looked up at her in surprise before he said, "I want some lady slippers in my garden, Mamma. You had some last summer, and they were so pretty, all white and red with little bits of slippers in them. So I am just going to plant these old shoes. You don't want them any more, and then I'll have lady slippers when they grow." "Oh, dear me, what a memory you have," said his mother, laughing, as she thought of the pretty flowers Birdie admired so much, and how his father had said in a joke, "They grew from old shoes." But seeing the child's puzzled look, she only said, "Give me the slippers, dear, for they will not grow, and I will give you some seeds that I picked from the flowers we had last summer." So Birdie dug up the shoes with rather a long face at their dusty appearance, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mamma, I won't do it again." And then he went to work and planted the flower seeds his kind mamma gave him. His mother left him again, and it was not long before he came in quite warm and tired, and said, "My garden is all done, Mamma, and my wheelbarrow is put away in the tool house, and I'll try to be patient and wait until everything grows. But," he added with a sigh, I hope it won't be very long. His mother told him he would have plenty to do with weeding and watering his garden, and then advised him to look for clean hands and face in the bathroom, as dinner was just ready. After dinner, Papa heard the history of the garden, and at the end of it, Birdie said, "Don't you think they make dear little weeny watering pots at the Tin Man's, Papa?" The Tin Man made everything according to Birdie, for as most of his toys were tin and were often sent to the shop to be mended, he thought there was nothing the Tin Man could not make or mend, and often proposed taking broken china to the Tin Man to be repaired. This time he was right, however, and his father promised to look for a nice little watering pot when he went to the village, and then Birdie ran off to play with his kitten. That evening he was on the front porch when he heard a step and found it was Thomas going into the garden with a large watering pot. "Oh, Thomas," said the child, "won't you water my garden?" "Haven't time, sir. You must tend to your own garden, your mother said," answered Thomas, hurrying on. Birdie thought he would see what he could do with Nancy, for his papa and mamma had gone out for a drive. So he ran into the kitchen and then into the shed, calling "Nancy!" But no sooner had he reached the shed than he saw, standing near the pump, the weeniest, nicest little water pot that ever was. There it stood, bright and new, as if it had just come from the Tin Man's. "Oh, it's for me! It's mine!" shouted Birdie, and seizing Nancy's dress, he pulled her towards it, saying, "See there, isn't it sweet? Won't you put some water in it, Nancy dear? I want to water my garden." The cook was very fond of the little boy, and though she seemed to be busy, she said, "Sure then, it's meself likes to please you when you ask so purty." And filling the little watering pot at the pump, she helped Birdie to carry it to his garden, where together they managed to give each plant a drink of water. When a place was found in the tool house for the new possession, and the tired little boy found his place in bed, his first thought the next morning was of the new watering pot, and he told his mamma about it and asked her if she knew where it came from. "Is it too large for the fairies to carry?" asked she, smiling. "Yes, indeed, mamma, unless they were big fairies, most as big as me," said he, trying to look tall. "Well, dear, it was a fairy even bigger than you, a grown-up fairy called Papa. There he is now, coming in at the gate. Run and thank him for it, and tell him breakfast is ready," answered his mother. Birdie ran and jumped into his father's arms and cried, "Thank you, dear kind Fairy Papa." "For what?" said his papa, seeming surprised. "Why, for that dear little new watering pot. Didn't you get it for me at Mr. Tin Man's? Now, tell the truth, Papa." "Well, if I must tell the truth, Birdie, I did get a small watering pot at the Tin Man's yesterday, and so it pleases my little gardener, does it? I'm glad to hear it." And with a kiss and a toss in the air, Birdie was landed on the porch, and they went into breakfast. As soon as it was over, Birdie asked his father and mother to go and look at his garden, and as they consented, he hopped along in front of them until he came to the path that ran by his border, and then he stood still, looking with great surprise at his little garden. What do you think he saw, little ones? I don't suppose you can guess, but as I happen to know, I will tell you. There was the bed he had left the night before without a flower in it, but it was now filled with the loveliest flowers he had ever seen. In the center was a rose bush with beautiful pink roses on it, and around it were small plants, some with white and red blossoms, and other with purple flowers that were very sweet-scented. That was enough to delight a little boy who had expected to wait 2 or 3 weeks to see his plants bloom. After staring at this wonderful sight for a few minutes, Birdie gave a shout of joy, and clapping his hands called out, "Oh, come quick, Papa, Mama, come see the flowers. They're so sweet." His parents hurried up to him with smiling faces, and as they saw the verbenias and roses, they said, "Where did they come from, Birdie? Did you plant them last night?" "No," said he. "I just watered the plants Mama moved, and there wasn't a single flower on them, and now my garden is full. I guess the fairies must have brought them." Birdie's grammar was apt to be forgotten when he was excited, you see. His father smiled at his speech, and laying his hands on his wife's shoulder, said, "Yes, a good fairy brought them for you, my child. Here she is." For a moment, Birdie looked rather puzzled, but he soon understood it, and, seizing his mother's hand, said, "Oh, you dear, darling Mama, you're the bestest fairy in the whole world. Now I've 2 good fairies." His mother bent over him fondly and said, "I told you, my pet, that the fairy Love would help you if you were good and patient, and this is some of that fairy's work. When I saw you so patiently waiting for your plants to bloom, I determined to go to the greenhouse last evening with Papa and bring home these flowers to surprise you." Then his mother explained to him that garden plants could not be moved when in bloom because it was apt to injure the roots, and that made the flowers wither. But greenhouse plants were raised in pots and could be taken from place to place and even planted out while they were in blossom. Then Birdie insisted on giving a flower to his mamma to put in her hair, and as she knew it would please him, she consented. He then took one of the prettiest pink blossoms and felt perfectly happy when his mother kissed and thanked him and placed it in her glossy hair. He said, "I'm going to be good all the days now and never drive my kind fairies away." And Birdie tried faithfully to keep his good resolution, and we hope all our little friends will follow his example. For when patience and obedience are in the hearts of little children, love is never far distant. End of section 4, Birdie's Garden.
Section 5 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. Section 5, The Dew Fairies. There was a thunderstorm one warm afternoon in the summer, a few weeks after Birdie had made his pretty little garden, and as he could not go out to play, he watched from the window how the great black clouds chased one another swiftly across the sky, seeming to growl angrily when they met, and sending sharp flashes of lightning at each other like the gleam of giant swords. Birdie fancied that there were giants living above the clouds, as there were when Jack climbed his wonderful beanstalk, and that all the noise and tumult was caused by a great battle going on among them. But when the rain began to fall in heavy drops, and then in fast driving showers, he thought the giants were sorry for their bad conduct, and were crying and then making up, and he felt more kindly towards them, and hoped none of them had been hurt in the battle. Soon the rain stopped, and the clouds floated away, leaving only a few white heaps against the blue sky, looking like snow-covered hills, thought Birdie, though Birdie said, "They look just like the white balls on top of Mamma's custard." Just then the sun looked out from the curtains where he had hidden from the storm, and everything seemed smiling and happy. Now that the storm was over, the little boy ran out to sit on the porch and look about. He thought the grass never had been so green before, nor the flowers so bright, and the air seemed fresher and sweeter than usual. The birds were singing sweetly in the trees, and the gentle cows were going slowly past the house on their way to the farmyard, going slowly as if sorry to leave the sweet-scented grass and clover in the meadows where they had been resting under the trees that grew near the brook. All these pleasant sights made Birdie feel very happy. He looked around him with a smiling face, drew in long breaths of the delicious air, and felt like saying thank you to the kind Father in heaven who had made all these beautiful things. He sat quite still for some time, thinking with his eyes fixed on the grass waving near him, all shining with the rain. Suddenly he started, rubbed his eyes with his hands, and then stared at the grass more than ever, for it seemed to him that something moved beside the grass, something like one of the Rose Fairies, only still lighter and more airy, and dressed in a thin, floating dress of silvery green. "Can it be that fairies live in the grass?" said Birdie to himself in great surprise. "I will be as still as a mouse and watch." And then he sat very quiet, with his blue eyes wide open to watch for fairies, and now and then he smiled softly to himself in his wonder and delight. Sure enough, there they were, not only on one blade of grass, but on many. Little fairies, light as thistledown, were dancing and swaying about, or swinging on the bending blades of grass, each one dressed in an airy robe of shining green, with beautiful bright crowns on their heads made of dewdrops which sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Very merry they seemed, and very busy too, for they scattered handfuls of tiny dewdrops wherever they went, and the grass and flowers bent lovingly to meet them, as if glad to feel their touch. Closely little Birdie watched the fairies, hardly breathing lest he should frighten them away, and he was so quiet they did not know he was there, but danced about as if they had been alone. At last 2 or 3 of them, floating along, came to a spider's web stretched from one tuft of grass to another, fine as lace, and yet strong enough to make a good carpet for their tiny feet. They seemed pleased at this, and began dancing merrily upon the web, all the while showering dewdrops from their hands and hair, until the web was strung with shining beads and glistened like silver. Was not that beautiful? Birdie was delighted, as he well might be, for it is not every little boy who can see such a wonderful sight as this, and if he had not been gentle and loving, I do not suppose he would have seen a single fairy. Soon his bright eyes caught sight of an old black spider, the owner of the web, who was crouching in one corner, looking half frightened and very much puzzled at the strange insects that had taken possession of his home. Now and then the old fellow would dart out at them as if to drive them away, but he always met with such a shower of dewdrops that he crawled back to his corner in a hurry. There he sat, all drawn up in a heap, looking like an old colored man whom Birdie once saw playing the violin at a picnic while the children danced. It was so comical that the little boy could keep still no longer, but burst into such a merry peal of laughter that he rolled over on the porch floor and lay there laughing until his mother came out to see what amused him so much. "Oh, mamma," said he, "if you were only a little boy like me, you could see the sweetest, most weeniest fairies. They dance on the grass, mamma, and on the cobwebs, and the old black spiders have to play the violin. Oh, dear, it is too funny!" And he danced up and down and laughed again as he thought of it. His mother smiled and said, "I am sorry I am too old to see the fairies, but I should like to hear about them." And Birdie told her, as well as such a little boy could, all that he had seen. "My darling," said his mamma when his story was done, "you must have seen the Dew Fairies, who watered the grass and flowers at night to cool them after the heat of the day." Birdie nodded very wisely and turned around to find his little friends, but they had all gone. Only the bright dew shining on the grass and flowers showed where they had been at work. He was half ready to cry when he missed them, but his mamma told him that the fairies had many fields and gardens to visit and could not stay long in one place, even to please her good little boy. "And Birdie, as I cannot see the beautiful little things, won't you be my Dew Fairy?" The child looked up in wonder to see what his mother meant, and said thoughtfully, "I would like to be one, dear mamma, but I am too big to dance on a cobweb, and I have no pretty green dress." "No, dear," said his mamma, "but you can be one without that, by being kind and generous to all, and trying to make others happy." And kissing his rosy lips, she went into the house, leaving Birdie very busy thinking. He had not been alone very long when he heard the latch of the garden gate rattle once or twice. He looked up, and what do you think he saw? There stood the tame colt, Alice, with her head over the gate, looking at him with her large brown eyes. Birdie loved Alice, and had often patted her smooth face and given her pieces of sugar or bread, so the colt had walked out of the meadow when the bars were down to look for her little friend. "Now," thought Birdie, "I can give Alice some sugar and make her happy," and he bustled into the house to ask for it. His mother gave him some very willingly, and he carried it out to Alice. She took it gently from his little hand and rubbed her face against his shoulder lovingly, and Birdie was glad he had given her all the sugar instead of eating some himself, as he felt like doing at first, for he loved sweet things as much as any little boy, but he loved to be generous still more. Then he gathered some grass, all cool with the dew, and gave it to Alice, and would have given her more, but she heard a man calling, "Cup, cup, cup," and she knew he had some salt for her. So she started, tossed her head as a good-bye to kind little Birdie, and trotted away. The child opened the gate and peeped out to watch the colt. He did not go outside, for he was not allowed to when alone. While he stood there, leaning against the gate, he heard a strange noise behind him, like something knocking against the stones, and he turned quickly to look up the road and find out what it was. You see, Birdie always kept his eyes and ears open, except when he was asleep, and so he never missed anything. And now he saw slowly coming down the road a poor lame soldier who had to walk on crutches, which knocked against the stones noisily. Birdie knew that all good people were very kind to the soldiers, and he thought, too, of the Dew Fairies. And as the man drew near, he opened the gate wide and called out, "Come in, soldier boy, come in, and I'll give you some bread and milk to make you well." The man stopped, looked at Birdie, and then walked into the garden and sat down on the porch steps as if he were very tired. Birdie came in too, but did not stop until he reached the dining room, where his mamma had just made a bowl full of bread and milk for his supper. "Oh, mamma," said he, "there's a poor lame soldier boy out on the porch, so lame," and he held up one little foot and tried to walk like the soldier. "Can't I take him some bread and milk to make him well?" And seeing his mamma looked pleased, he took the bowl with both hands and carried it out to his friend. His mamma followed him, bringing a spoon, which Birdie had forgotten in his haste, and when she had given it to the poor man, she sat down, took her little boy on her lap, and talked kindly to the soldier, asking him his name and how he had been wounded. He said his name was John Wilson, that he had been wounded in a battle, and had been in hospital for some weeks, but was now going home to see his mother. "She can make me well sooner than all the doctors," added he, with a smile. "But why do you walk so far, my poor fellow, when you are so lame and weak?" asked the lady. The soldier said that he had come in the cars as far as he could, and expected his mother would send to the station to meet him. "But the wagon was not there," said he, "and I was in such a hurry to see my dear old mother that I started off to walk. I was beginning to feel very weak and tired, and might have fallen by the wayside if this kind little man had not asked me to rest and given me this nice bread and milk. I feel better already, and think I can walk home now." But Birdie's mother said she did not think it would be right for him to walk any more that night, but if he would wait until they had finished tea, her husband would take him home in the wagon. The poor soldier thanked her with tears in his eyes, and said he must get home and should be glad of a lift. So Thomas was told to get the wagon ready, and they went in to tea. Birdie was so pleased that he had helped the poor man that he could think of nothing else, and for a while he talked very merrily, but by the time he had finished his bread and milk he grew very quiet, and his mamma found he was nodding in his high chair. She knew he was very tired, and lifting him down gently would have carried him upstairs, but the blue eyes opened a little, and a sleepy voice said, "Where's my soldier boy? Did the fairies take him away?" His mamma laughed at the funny little boy and took him out on the porch to say good-bye to the soldier, who kissed him and said, "Birdie must come and see me some day." And then the soldier got into the wagon, and Birdie's papa drove away from the gate. Birdie's mamma then took him to bed, kissing him and telling him he was her darling little Dew Fairy. End of Section 5, The Dew Fairies.
Section 6, Birdie and his Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Birdie and his Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. The Fruit Fairies. "Would you like to take a ride with me today, my boy?" asked Birdie's father one morning as they finished breakfast. "Oh, yes, papa. Where are you going?" replied the child eagerly, running to his father to hear all about their drive. "Well, I think we had better go to a peach orchard and get some good peaches for mamma to preserve, and then, perhaps, we can find out where John Buesing lives and stop to see him for a while. I'm sure you would like to go and see your soldier boy," answered the father with a smile. "Yes, indeed, papa," exclaimed Birdie, clapping his hands and jumping up and down for joy. "I want to see if his poor foot is well yet, and if his mother was proud to see him. I'll go and ask mamma to give me some cakes to take to him." "Very well," said his father. "Ask mamma to give me some cakes too for lunch. And Birdie, get ready the baskets for lots of peaches while I see about the wagon." Birdie hurried away with his messages, looking very important, and after running about and talking very fast in his excitement, he found himself with some help from mamma all ready for his journey. He was standing on the front porch with a small basket in each hand and several large ones around him, when his father drove up to the gate, and he looked so odd that his father laughed and sang out to the tune of Yankee Doodle, "I scarce can see my little boy because of all the baskets." Then Birdie's mother helped him into the wagon and told him to be very good and not to eat too much fruit, and Birdie promised to be very good and kissed his hand for good-bye as they drove off. The little boy then told his father that the littlest basket held cakes and fruit for his soldier boy, and the next littlest held their lunch, but the big fellows were for the peaches. His father smiled at this explanation and put the small baskets carefully away in the box of the wagon, and when Birdie asked if he might help drive, he gave him the ends of the reins to hold, and they went on their way very merrily. After quite a long drive, they stopped at a stone mill beside a pretty stream. A bridge crossed the stream and led to the opposite bank, where the miller's cottage stood under some shady trees. A girl stood on the bridge holding a little child and watching two boys who were fishing in the stream. Birdie saw all this while his father talked to the miller, and felt like asking if he might go and see how many fish the boys had caught, but as soon as his father had finished talking, he drove on after saying, "Thank you, good morning," to the miller, and as Birdie had promised to be a good boy, he did not say anything about his wish to get out and see the little fisherman. "Why did you say thank you to the miller, papa? He did not give you anything, did he?" asked Birdie, after being quiet for about 2 minutes, a long silence for him. "Yes, he gave me something, but you did not see it, for I put it right away in my knowledge box," answered his father. Then, seeing the child puzzled look, he added, The miller gave me information, or taught me, by his words, where to find the peach orchard, and I put the knowledge safely away in my head, which is my knowledge box. When you are taught anything, Birdie, you should always say thank you, for knowledge is one of the best gifts you can receive. Yes, papa, answered Birdie very gravely, I will, and then I put it away in my noodle box until it gets all full of things. And from that time he often talked of his noodle box, being fond of long words, though he did not always get them quite right. Soon afterwards they drove through a large wide gate and along a shady lane until they came to the farmhouse belonging to the peach orchard, when who should Birdie see standing at the gate but his soldier boy, John Wilson. The orchard was on his father's farm, and Birdie had a pleasant surprise of meeting his friend sooner than he expected, and was glad to find him looking better and able to walk without his crutches. When John found that they wanted peaches, he said, "Yes, indeed, you shall have the best in the orchard to take to the kind lady who helped me home to my mother." Then the baskets were brought out of the wagon, and the littlest one was given to John, who thanked Birdie and took the basket to the house to be emptied. When he came back, two little girls were running after him with sunbonnets on and little baskets in their hands. "Can we go to the orchard now, John?" said they. "And I reckon so," said John pleasantly. So they all started off, John going first with Birdie and telling him that the oldest girl was named Lottie and the youngest May, and that they were spending the summer with their mother at the farm. Then he said to the little girls, "This is my particular friend, Master Birdie, the bread and milk boy. You know I have often told you about him." And pretty soon the children were talking very sociably together. When they reached the orchard, what a beautiful sight it was! They stood in the midst of low, wide-spreading trees, and could see the round, rosy peaches hanging on every limb, and loading the branches so heavily that some were bent nearly to the ground. And oh, how good the peaches were, so ripe and sweet and juicy! Better than peaches ever had tasted before, Birdie thought, and he was right, for fruit is always best when fresh from the tree. After they had all eaten some fruit, Birdie's father said he might play with the little girls while he attended to the peaches. Birdie took the little basket and joined Lottie and May, who were looking on the ground for peaches, for they were allowed to come there every day and eat any good peaches they could find on the ground, or pick them up to take to their mother. "But we must not take any off of the trees," said Lottie, and little May added, "'cause we might pick some what wasn't ripe." They worked merrily for some time, and the three little baskets were nearly full when something happened that stopped their fun for a while. Would you like to hear what it was? Well, I suppose you would, so I will tell you. Birdie had wandered a little way from the girls, and was just rejoicing over a large red peach, which he thought would fill up his basket nicely, when, as he turned it over to admire it, something flew out of a hole in it, and the next instant Birdie felt as if a sharp needle were running into his hand, and saw that a large yellow wasp was stinging him. He screamed with fright and tried to shake it off, but it stuck fast to his hand, and he had to push it off with his peach and throw peach and wasp both far away, and then run with all his might to get rid of the cross insect. His hand pained him so much he could not help crying, and when he came running up to Lottie and May, he told them about the bad wasp, and showed them where it had stung him. They were very sorry. Lottie said they had better run home and get their mamma to put something on the place to take away the pain, so they all hurried towards the house, leaving their baskets in the orchard. Lottie was a year older than Birdie. was very kind and helped him and little May over the fence and led them along the lane and through the garden to the front porch where a pleasant-looking lady was sitting with a sweet little baby in her arms. But as soon as she saw that the children were in some trouble, she put the baby down on the floor and went to meet them, saying kindly, "What is the matter, Lottie?" Lottie told her of Birdie's accident and showed her the poor little red hand, and she seemed very sorry, but said, "I think you can soon cure it, Birdie." Then, taking the little boy on her knee, she sent Lottie for a basin of water and a towel, and asked May to bring her some earth in her little tin bucket. When the little girls returned, she bathed the sore hand gently, then putting a little water into the earth which May had brought, and said, "Now, Birdie, I'm going to make a beautiful mud pie. Put it on your hand." The children laughed at this, and Birdie thought she was a very queer lady, though she did not like to say anything, but sure enough, when the earth and water were mixed together, she put a round lump of it on Birdie's hand, saying, "There, it will soon be well, my boy. Mud pie is the best cure to be found for a sting." It was a strange cure, certainly, but Birdie soon felt the good effects of it, for the pain and heat grew less, and he began to smile at Lottie and May, and to say, "Thank you, ma'am," to the lady when she bathed his red face with the cool water. Then the children's mother said they must not go back to the orchard while it was so warm, but that they might stay with her and play some quiet game until dinner was ready. "Or you might tell us a fairy story, mamma. That would keep us quiet. Don't you love fairy stories, Birdie?" said Lottie in a pleading tone. "Yes, indeed," was the earnest reply. "My mamma tells them sometimes to me, and I'd like to hear your mamma tell one ever so much." Little May chimed in too, saying, "Oh, yes, mamma, tell we a fairy story, a nice one for Bertie." Their mother smiled and consented, and just then the nurse came to put baby to sleep, and May climbed upon her mother's knee, while Lottie and Birdie settled themselves comfortably to hear the wonderful story of the Fruit Fairies. This story is about a naughty little girl. She had a kind father and mother, and a good old nurse, a pleasant home, and plenty of toys, but still she was very naughty. When she could not do as she chose, or when she hurt herself, in fact, when anything happened that she did not like, she would get angry and pout and cry, or even scream, until everyone wanted to stop up their ears and run away from the terrible noise. Her mother and nurse often told her how wrong it was to behave in such a way, and sometimes she was punished by having her mouth tied up with a folded handkerchief, as if she had the toothache. At such times she seemed sorry and would promise to do better, but she always forgot her promise when she grew angry and made as much noise as ever. One day Laura, for that was her name, had been very naughty indeed. She had even told her good nurse to go away and never come back, and had been rude to her mamma. What was still worse, she was not sorry for her bad conduct, but continued so cross all day that at bedtime her mother said to her, "Laura, I am very much grieved at your bad behavior, and I fear I shall have to ask your father to send you away from nurse and me, as you treat us so rudely, and let you live with your great aunt. Perhaps she can make you a better girl." Now Laura had often heard of this great aunt, but had never seen her. She knew that she was a very old lady who lived in a large house in the country, with a pretty garden around it, and that she did not like naughty children at all, although she was very kind to good ones. The idea of being sent to live with this old lady without either mamma or nurse to take care of her made Laura very unhappy. She cried and begged her mother not to send her away. She said she was sorry she had treated them all so badly, and promised to try with all her might to be a good girl. But her mother only shook her head sadly, saying, "I'm tired of your naughty ways and broken promises, and I shall certainly speak to your father about it tonight." So Laura went off to bed in a passion and cried herself to sleep. Whether she slept so soundly that she knew nothing of the journey or how it happened, I can't tell, but when next she opened her eyes everything looked strange and new to her, and there was no good nurse or kind mamma to be seen. Laura jumped up quickly and tried to dress herself that she might go and look for them, and after some trouble and many wishes for nurse, she got washed and dressed and went downstairs. The large house was dark and quiet, and Laura saw no one, though she looked into several rooms until she opened the door of a little breakfast room, when she saw a very strange old lady at the table. She wore high-heeled shoes, a blue skirt with a red gown tucked up over it, a large white apron, and a pointed cap, but the strangest part of all was her face, for it looked just like a face made out of a hickory nut, it was so small and brown and sharp, and her eyes were as quick and bright as two coals of fire. Laura knew this was her great-aunt, who did not like naughty children at all. She felt very much frightened, and would have screamed, but was afraid to. The old lady called her into the room, and gave her some brown bread and butter, and a glass of milk, saying sternly, "There is your breakfast, child, eat it, and go out in the garden." Laura did not dare to say a word, though she did not like brown bread at all, but ate her breakfast quietly, and saying, "Thank you, ma'am," very politely hurried out of the room. "Put on your hat and sack, and shut the door after you," called out the old lady in her stern voice, and again Laura felt like being cross or saying, "I don't want to," but thought she had better not, so did as she was told, though her face turned very red with trying to keep still, for she was so in the habit of crying and screaming that it was very hard work to be good. Once in the garden, however, Laura felt quite happy for a while. There were many quantities of lovely flowers in the flower beds, and such a tempting little rake and hoe in one corner. Laura felt sure they were for her, and began making a garden very busily, and when she had put the ground in good order, she gathered some flowers to plant it. She only stuck them in the ground by the stems, and it's true, but it was wonderful to see how bright and fresh they looked, and how firmly they stood up, just as if they were growing there. For a long time Laura was good, and worked pleasantly, and her garden looked very pretty. But at last she scratched her finger with a rose thorn, not very badly, a little rubbing and patience would soon have cured it, but the pain made her very angry, and forgetting where she was, she began to cry and scold the flowers, stamping on the ground, and throwing her little rake and hoe as far away as she could. Ah, poor naughty Laura! She soon saw something that made her feel too sorry to cry. Her rake and hoe broke into 100 pieces, though they fell on the soft grass, and each piece rolled away as if to hide itself, and Laura never could find them again. And then her garden. Oh, that was a sad sight now. Every flower hung drooping and dying, with their bright colours faded, and all their firmness gone, as if grieved to death by the cross words Laura had spoken to them. And the pain of the scratch was nothing now to the pain in the heart, as she saw how her beautiful garden was spoiled by her hasty temper and foolish habit of crying at every little hurt. She felt very much afraid, too, lest her great-aunt should have heard the noise, and should come to punish her, and putting her hand over her mouth to keep back her sobs, she rushed away like the wind, and never stopped until she found herself in a cool, shady orchard filled with fruit trees of all kinds. She sat down there to rest and think over her wicked conduct, and after many sad but quiet tears of sorrow, which are the only right kind of tears, she resolved to try to be a real good little girl and not cry or scream any more, no matter what happened. After this, Laura felt better and soon began to walk along under the fruit trees and look at the fruit with which they were loaded. She had never seen such a wonderful orchard before. Not only pears, peaches, apples, and cherries grew there, all ripe at once, but splendid oranges, bananas, figs, and dates hung from the trees, and rows of gooseberries, currants, and strawberries grew between them. It made Laura's eyes dance to see such quantities of delicious fruit, but she did not touch any, for she knew it would not be right to do so without her aunt's permission. On and on she walked, singing softly to herself, and looking so good and happy that the fruit fairies, who took care of the orchard, for it was a fairy orchard, were very much pleased with their little visitor. One after another peeped out from among the green leaves, nodding their rosy faces at Laura, and then hiding again so quickly that she could scarcely tell whether they were fairies or fruit. But as she still walked on quietly and looked about pleasantly, she saw more and more of the bright faces nodding to her in a friendly way, for fairies love good children and like to be their friends and playmates. Presently a ripe cherry flew right into Laura's mouth, and a clear little voice sang out, "Eat, eat, isn't sweet." And she did eat, you may be sure, and as a shower of cherries came flying at her, just then she had a splendid treat, for they were the very best cherries she had ever eaten. Then she went on singing her thanks to her new friends in these words: "I thank you, kind fairies, for all those fine cherries." Laura never knew before that she could make rhymes, and it was not a very good rhyme either, but as she sang it several times in a merry way, it seemed to please the fruit fairies, and after a few minutes she heard another clear little voice singing, "Look well on the ground and keep what is found." And looking down carefully, Laura saw at her feet a beautiful large orange, so large that she had to take it in both hands to lift it up. "Oh, thank you, dear friends, for the gift your love sends," sang the happy little girl, thinking to herself that it was very easy to be good after all, and that her great aunt's orchard was a lovely place. But just then, I am sorry to say, she tripped over a stone and fell against a tree, bruising her forehead against the hard bark. It was not pleasant, certainly, to get such a fall, and besides, her beautiful orange was thrown out of her hands and broken to pieces on the ground. This accident and the pain together made Laura very angry, and forgetting where she was, she screamed with rage and began to strike and kick the stone and tree which had hurt her, and acted just like a crazy little girl. Then everything changed in a moment. The good fruit fairies hid themselves in sorrow and fright, and no more rosy faces could be seen peeping out from the leaves, no more sweet voices were to be heard, but spiteful and mischievous elves came crowding around the naughty child, mocking her cries, and kicking and striking at her, as she had done at the trees, while they pelted her with cherry stones, which felt like balls of hot lead. Great black spiders slid down from the trees by long threads and dangled before her face, and when she turned aside to avoid them, Ugly snakes, toads, and caterpillars were in her path, and angry wasps were buzzing fiercely around her head and trying to sting her, so that along she began to rush blindly through the orchard like a wild thing, hair and hat flying behind her, and her dress catching on the brambles and tearing at every step. Just as she was about to despair, she saw a wide, muddy ditch before her, and was just going to plunge into it, head foremost, to escape from her enemies, when she felt a hand on her arm and heard a voice saying, "Why, Miss Laura, what is the matter with you?" She started and looked up, and there, to her joy, she saw her own good old nurse watching her anxiously, and when she came to herself a little more, she found that she was in her own bed at home, but she was still so frightened that she clung to her nurse and cried out, "Oh, save me, nursie, and I'll never be naughty again." It was a long time before she could be comforted, and could believe that she had only been dreaming, but when nurse promised to speak to her mamma that very night, and ask her not to send Laura away to her great aunt's, because she was really going to be good girl, then Laura felt happier, and went to sleep, after thanking her kind nurse, and had no more strange dreams. From that time she began to improve, and in a few weeks grew so quiet and gentle that her mother gave up the thought of sending her to stay with her great aunt, and if she sometimes felt like crying and screaming in the old way, she would put her hand over her mouth and run to her room to think over her strange adventures in the orchard, and the lessons she had learned from the Fruit Fairies. Lottie and May laughed and clapped their hands when the story was done, for they had heard one like it before, but Birdie drew a long breath, as if quite relieved, and said, "I'm glad it was only a dream, for I shouldn't like all those ugly things to be in our orchard or in John's either." Lottie laughed at this and replied, "Oh, it was only a dream, of course, Birdie. She'd been so naughty she had bad dreams, but I think it's a splendid story." "I think it's a splendid story too, Buffalo," chimed in little May. She meant that it was beautiful, but could not say it any better. By this time the dinner horn had sounded, and the children saw John Wilson and his father, and Birdie's father, coming towards the house, all carrying baskets full of peaches, which they placed carefully in the wagon. John brought in the three little baskets, and when Birdie looked into his, he found it filled with large ripe peaches, all packed in with soft, cool grass. "Please take those to your mother, with my compliments," said John Wilson, when Birdie thanked him. Then they all went to dinner, and enjoyed the good country fare very much, and Birdie made them all laugh by saying he thought apple pie was a heap nicer than mud pie. After dinner, John's two younger brothers took the children to the meadow, where the men were making hay, and they all had great fun playing puss in the corner and hide and seek among the piles of hay. At last they hid little May inside of a great soft pile of hay, so that Lottie and Birdie had a long search after her, and could not imagine where she was until she peeped out and said, "Here I is." She thought it very good fun, and did not want to leave her nest even when the game was over, for after a while Birdie's father came to take him home, and he had to say good-bye to his dear little friends. They begged him to come and spend another day at the farm, and Birdie said he would, if papa would bring him. Then John carried the little boy to the wagon, and packed him in among the peach baskets very comfortably. I think you will not be surprised to hear that, after all the adventures of the day, Birdie soon fell asleep with his head on his father's knee, and slept all the way home. End of section 6, the Fruit Fairies.
Section 7 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Melinda Fogle. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. Birdie's Search for a Fairy. One day, Birdie was a very naughty boy. I will tell you how it happened. His father and mother had gone away in the wagon to spend the day with Grandma, and had told Birdie not to go out of the garden, but to play there quietly until Nancy or Miss Hannah called him to dinner. Birdie had listened attentively and promised to obey, and that made it so much the worse for him to behave as he did. For even very little children know what a promise means and how wrong it is to break one. For a while, Birdie was very good and sat on the porch steps with his kitten in his arms, trying to sing her to sleep. He sang all the little songs he knew, and at last began, "Bye, oh baby bunting, Papa's gone a-hunting, gone to get a rabbit skin to wrap my baby bunting in." This seemed to please him very much, as he sang it several times, and then, finding Kitty was asleep, he put her down gently on the soft grass and sat still a little longer, thinking. I am afraid his song put some funny thoughts into his noddle-box, for pretty soon he jumped up, saying, "Yes, I'm going to hunt for a fairy today, for I want one to play with, and I'm going to hunt everywhere till I find one." Then he started off to search through the garden for one of his fairy friends. Up and down the paths he wandered, looking into every bush and searching every nook and corner, but no fairies could he find. At last he remembered that the fairies were very little and loved to rest in the sweet flowers, so he began his search again and peered into the beautiful white bells of the tall lilies, where he only saw a yellow bee at work gathering honey. Not caring to disturb it after his adventure in the peach orchard, he hurried away to look among the roses still blooming near the house, to see if any rose fairies could be found in them. There, to his great joy, Birdie saw a large red butterfly, resting on a rose and moving its spotted wings to and fro, as if enjoying the bright sunshine. Now, if Birdie had been as good and gentle as usual, and watched the pretty thing quietly, who knows what might have happened? Something very pleasant, perhaps. But instead of being good, Birdie cried out, "Now I've found one!" and sprang up to catch the butterfly in his hand, but it was too quick for him and flew away in a moment, leaving the little boy with a handful of rose leaves and a scratch on his wrist from the thorns. Still, he was determined to catch it, and watching it closely, he chased it around the garden, running over beds and borders in his haste, and doing much mischief in Thomas's neat domain. At last, the red butterfly sailed slowly before him, as he stopped to take breath and settled on a cabbage leaf, very near Birdie. In a moment, his straw hat was in his hand, and he crept slyly towards the place, and pounced down on the poor butterfly with such force that he lost his balance and went head foremost into the cabbage bed, with his face in the mud and his heels in the air. He was more frightened than hurt, however, especially when he found, on getting back to his feet again, that he had broken 2 or 3 fine cabbage plants in his fall, and hearing Miss Hannah, who was sewing for his mamma, calling him, the little boy ran away to the front yard and hid himself under the porch, feeling very much ashamed of his conduct, while the red butterfly flew away over the garden fence. Birdie stayed in his queer hiding place for some time,
expecting to hear Thomas or Miss Hannah coming to scold him, but as no one came, he crept out after a while and went to the gate to look about. He soon heard voices and saw 5 children coming along the road, carrying buckets and baskets and talking very noisily. There were 2 boys and 3 girls, and Birdie knew they were the farmer's children, and that his mother did not like him to play with them. But this was his naughty day, you know, and it seemed as if he forgot all the good lessons of his kind parents and acted like a wild Indian. When the children came near, he opened the gate and, looking out, said, "Where you all going, children?" "We're going down in the meadow to get blackberries," answered one of the boys. "Don't you want to go with us? We'll lend you a bucket, and you can get a whole lot for supper." This sounded very tempting to lonely little Birdie, and after a few more persuasions, he concluded to go, because he hadn't any blackberries for a good many whiles. And taking the tin bucket Jane lent him, he hurried off towards the meadow with his new friends. Now these children knew that Birdie was not allowed to go away from the garden, nor to play with them, and it was very wrong for them to persuade him to go. They also knew that they were not allowed to go into the meadow to pick blackberries, because Thomas was trying to cultivate some of the vines and did not wish anyone to meddle with them. But Thomas had gone away, and so these naughty children concluded to go and take Birdie with them, that the blame might fall upon him if they were seen there. Well, when little boys disobey their parents and play with bad companions, they nearly always meet with some punishment, and so it happened with our friend Birdie. The children crossed a little bridge and soon found their way to the thicket where the blackberries grew, and went to work very merrily, picking some to put in the baskets and buckets they carried, and eating some too, for the berries were large and ripe, and many a juicy one was popped into their mouths instead of into the buckets. Birdie thought it was great fun, and yet he felt uneasy at times, and glanced around as if afraid of being seen. He would not have felt unhappy if he had not been doing wrong, would he? No, indeed. He would have enjoyed the fun much more if he had not been disobeying his parents. After they had picked a great many berries, and blackened their hands and faces with the juice, and torn their clothes in the briars, they began to think of going home, and had just taken up their baskets and found their hats and bonnets, when Jane, the oldest girl, cried out, "Oh, boys, run, run, there comes Thomas!" And sure enough, they all saw Thomas coming up the hill, shaking his cane and calling out, "Leave my blackberries alone, you young rogues!" They all started off to run home, frightened nearly to death. The youngest girl could not run fast enough, so the 2 boys took hold of her hands and helped her along, and Jane flew on ahead, leaving poor Birdie and Sarah to take care of themselves. They struggled on bravely, but as Thomas came nearer, Jane seized Sarah and dragged her along, and Birdie was deserted by those who had led him into mischief, and had to hurry on, as well as he could, by himself. When they reached the little bridge over the stream, the farmer's children rushed across it and ran on towards their home. But poor Birdie, so warm and tired that he was nearly blind, went too near the edge of the bridge and slipped off, right into the water. He screamed and caught at the edge of the boards with both hands, but the water felt very cold, and he began to cry, thinking how naughty he had been all day, and that now he was going to be drowned and never see his mamma any more, when Thomas came running to the bridge and pulled him out of the water, giving him a shake as he said, "There, served you right for stealing my blackberries." But when he saw that it was not a strange boy, but little Master Birdie standing there, dripping wet and crying too, he was very much surprised and quite worried, and without stopping to ask questions, he picked the child up and ran to the kitchen as fast as he could go. Greatly was Nancy astonished to see Birdie in such a plight, but Thomas would not let her stop to talk, but made her get dry clothes for Birdie and a warm blanket to wrap around him, and when he was rubbed dry and dressed comfortably, Nancy gave him a bowl of hot soup to drink and kept him wrapped in the blanket and sitting in front of the kitchen fire all the afternoon for fear he should take cold after his dip in the stream. This imprisonment was very tiresome to Birdie, but as he knew, it was caused by his own naughty conduct. He bore it quite patiently and answered gently and truthfully when Nancy and Miss Hannah asked him how the accident happened. He seemed so sorry for his bad behavior that Miss Hannah was willing to forgive him and offered to bring her sewing and sit by him when Nancy went out to milk. While they were sitting quietly together in the large and cheerful kitchen, the kind-hearted woman told Birdie a little story to teach him to be obedient and to stay home when he was told to do so. The story was about 3 little ducks who lived with their mother in a barnyard and were very happy and comfortable. One day, their mother said, "Children, I am going to market to buy a pound of butter, and I want you to stay in the barnyard until I come back. And if you are good, I will bring you all a stick of candy." The little ducks promised to mind their mother, so she locked up her house, put the key in her pocket, and putting on her best cloak and bonnet, she took her basket and went off to market. But she had not been gone very long before the oldest little duck said, "I'm going to the river to take a swim. Won't you all go with me?" The others said, "Oh, no, brother, don't go until Mother comes home. The water rats might get you." "Pooh, who's afraid of the water rats? I'm going. Goodbye," said this bad duck, and then he crept under the fence and went off. When he came to the river, he jumped in and began swimming about, for he could swim very well, but he was young and very fat. So, when the water rats saw him, they said, "Oh, Father, do get that nice fat duck for our dinner." "Keep very still, and I'll try to get it," said the father. And then he swam quietly underwater towards the little duck, and seizing him by the legs, dragged him home to the young water rats, who ate him up right away and said he was splendid. They left nothing of the poor duck but his 2 little yellow feet, which floated about on top of the water, looking very sad and lonely. When Mrs. Duck came home from market, she called her children to give them all a stick of candy, but only 2 little ducks came to meet her. "Where's your oldest brother?" said she. "Oh, Mother," said the other ducks, "he went to the river to swim, and he has not come back yet, and we're afraid the water rats have caught him." "Oh, mercy me! I must go and see," said the mother in great distress. And off she waddled to the river. But when she got there, of course, she saw nothing of her disobedient child but his 2 little yellow feet, which floated about on the top of the water, looking very sad and lonely. Then she knew that the water rats had eaten him, and she cried 3 days and 3 nights and did not eat any dinner. Well, she stayed with her children and took care of them for some weeks, but at last the pound of butter was gone, and she had to go to market to get another one. She told the little ducks to stay in the barnyard until she came home, and she would bring them each a ginger cake. They promised to obey her, but she had not been gone very long when the oldest little duck said, "I'm going to the woods to get blackberries." "Oh, don't go alone, brother," said the youngest duck. "The owls might get you." "Oh, psh! Who's afraid of owls? I'm going. Goodbye." And the bad duck crept under the fence and went off to the woods all alone. When he reached the woods, he could not find any blackberries until he got in some distance, where the woods were thick and black. But then he found some fine ripe berries and began eating them as fast as possible. While he was doing this, some young owls looked out of a tree overhead and saw him. "Oh, Father," said they, Do get that nice fat duck for our dinner. Do. Keep very still then, and I'll try to get it," said their father. And the next minute he flew quietly down and pounced on the poor duck, and carried him in his strong claws up to the nest where the owls were. Of course, they ate him for dinner and said he was delicious. They left nothing of him but his little yellow bill, which they threw out of the nest, and it fell at the foot of the tree, where it lay looking very sad and lonely. They kept his feet for fans, as they had not bought any yet for the summer, and thought it would save them the trouble of going to town. When Mrs. Duck came home from market, she called her children to give them a ginger cake. But only one little duck came to meet her. "Where's your brother?" said she. "Oh, mother," said the youngest duck, sobbing, "he went to the woods to get blackberries, and I'm afraid the owls have caught him." "Oh, mercy me, I must go and see," said the mother, and off she waddled to the woods. But after a long search, she could find nothing of her naughty child but his little yellow bill, which lay at the foot of a tree, looking very sad and lonely. Then she knew the owls had eaten him, and she cried 3 days and 3 nights, and did not eat any dinner. The youngest duck was much grieved at the sad fate of his brothers, and determined to obey every word his mother said, even when she was away at market. He kept his resolution, and never went out of the barnyard alone, but his kind mother often took him to the river to swim, and to the woods to get blackberries, and the water rats and owls were afraid to go near him, because his big, strong mother was close beside him. So he grew up to be a handsome large duck, with a beautiful green ring around his neck, and everyone loved him because he was so good and obedient. Birdie thanked Miss Hannah for telling him this story, and said he would try to be like the youngest duck, and mind his mamma, even when she was away off at Grandmamma's, and then he would be a good boy. Just then they heard the wagon drive up, and the cheerful tones of a voice saying, "Where is my Birdie boy?" But Birdie was much too ashamed to run out and spring into his mother's arms as he usually did when she had been away. He hid his face and begged Miss Hannah to go and tell his mamma all about his bad conduct before she came to see him. She went, but soon came back, looking very grave, and said, "Your mamma is very, very sorry to hear that you have been disobedient and rude today. And she says she does not wish to see you at all, but that you must get your supper in the kitchen and then go up to bed with Nancy." This was a severe punishment to Birdie, who had never before gone to bed without a good-night kiss. And he could not eat much supper, and went to bed crying so bitterly that Nancy felt very sorry, and went downstairs to tell Birdie's mother that the little boy was heartbroken entirely, and wouldn't she spake a word to him, please? His mother called to him then and said, "Good night, Birdie. I will forgive you now because you are sorry, but I cannot come to see you because I said I would not. I will talk to you tomorrow. Go to sleep now, quietly." This message and a kiss from good old Nancy gave the poor child some comfort, and he soon after forgot the troubles of his naughty day in a sound sleep. End of section 7. Birdie's Search for a Fairy.
Section 8 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret T. Canby. Section 8. The Frost Fairies. One morning, when Birdie awoke, he found himself alone, for he had slept so late that his mother had gone down to breakfast. He sat up in bed and looked around the room, and finding out that it was rather cold, he drew the covers close around him while he waited for Mamma or Nancy to come and dress him. As he waited, he glanced out the window to see if it was a sunny day, and found, to his surprise, the green leaves on the maple trees outside had changed to red and yellow leaves, and looked very bright and pretty as they fluttered in the sunlight. He watched them for some time, wondering if the fairies had been painting them, and making up his mind to be very good and quiet when he went out to play, that he might see them at work. When his mother came gently to the door to see if he was awake, he called out, "Come in, dear Mamma. I'm awake, and I want to get dressed and try to see the fairies painting the trees." His mother came in, carrying some warm clothes on her arm, and said, "It is a cold morning, Birdie. Jack Frost has come now, and you must be dressed in a thick dress to keep him from pinching you." "Did Jack Frost paint the leaves with those pretty colors, Mamma?" "I thought the fairies did it," said Birdie earnestly. His mother smiled and answered pleasantly, "I think Jack Frost had something to do with the bright leaves, dearie, but we might suppose that he sent many active little fairies abroad in the night, as the leaves have changed so suddenly from green to crimson, yellow, and brown." "Can't you tell me a story about those fairies, Mamma?" said Birdie, who was always ready to hear fairy stories. "Not now, dear. It is late, and your breakfast is waiting for you. But if you are a very good boy until my morning duties are done, and if you then say a nice long lesson to me, I will try to think of a story to tell you," said the lady. Birdie promised to be good, and as he had never broken his promises since the day of his tumble into the water, he kept it faithfully now, and after his lessons were over, his mother rewarded him by telling him the story of the Frost Fairies. King Frost, or Jack Frost as he is sometimes called, lives in a cold country far to the north. But every year he takes a journey over the world in a car of golden clouds, drawn by a strong and rapid steed called North Wind. Wherever he goes, he does many wonderful things. He builds bridges over every stream, clear as glass in appearance, but often strong as iron. He puts the flowers and plants to sleep by one touch of his hand, and they all bow down and sink into the warm earth until spring returns. Then, lest we should grieve for the flowers, he places at our windows lovely wreaths and sprays of his white northern flowers, or delicate little forests of fairy pine trees, pure white and very beautiful. But his most wonderful work is the painting of the trees, which look, after his task is done, as if they were covered with the brightest layers of gold and rubies, and are beautiful enough to comfort us for the flight of summer. I will tell you how King Frost first thought of this kind work, for it is a strange story. You must know that this king, like all other kings, has great treasures of gold and precious stones in his palace. But being a good-hearted old fellow, he does not keep his riches locked up all the time, but tries to do good and make others happy with them. He has 2 neighbors who live still farther north. One is King Winter, a cross and churlish old monarch who is hard and cruel and delights in making the poor suffer and weep. But the other neighbor is Santa Claus, a fine, good-natured, jolly old soul who loves to do good and who brings presents to the poor and to nice little children at Christmas. Well, one day King Frost was trying to think of some good that he could do with his treasure, and suddenly he concluded to send some of it to his kind neighbor Santa Claus to buy presents of food and clothing for the poor, that they might not suffer so much when King Winter went near their homes. So he called together his merry little fairies, and showing them a number of jars and vases filled with gold and precious stones, he told them to carry those carefully to the palace of Santa Claus and give them to him with the compliments of King Frost. "He will know how to make a good use of the treasure," added Jack Frost. Then he told the fairies not to loiter by the way, but to do his bidding quickly. The fairies promised obedience and soon started on their journey, dragging the great glass jars and vases along as well as they could, and now and then grumbling a little at having such hard work to do, for they were idle fairies and liked play better than work. At last they reached a great forest, and being quite tired, they decided to rest a while and look for nuts before going any farther. But lest the treasure should be stolen from them, they hid the jars among the thick leaves of the forest trees, placing some high up near the top and others in different parts of the various trees until they thought no one could find them. Then they began to wander about and hunt for nuts and climb the trees to shake them down, and worked much harder for their own pleasure than they had done for their master's bidding. For it is a strange truth that fairies and children never complain of the toil and trouble they take in search of amusement, although they often grumble when asked to work for the good of others. The Frost Fairies were so busy and so merry over their nutting frolic that they soon forgot their errand and their king's command to go quickly. But as they played and loitered in the forest until noon, they found out the reason why they were told to hasten. For although they had, as they thought, hidden the treasure so carefully, they had not secured it from the power of Mr. Sun, who was an enemy of Jack Frost, and delighted to undo his work and weaken him whenever he could. His bright eyes found out the jars of treasure among the trees, and as the idle fairies left them there until noon, at which time Mr. Sun is the strongest, the delicate glass began to melt and break, and before long every jar and vase was cracked or broken, and the precious treasures they contained were melting too, and dripping slowly in streams of gold and crimson over the trees and bushes of the forest. Still, for a while, the Frost Fairies did not notice this strange occurrence, for they were down on the grass, so far below the tree-tops that the wonderful shower of treasure was a long time in reaching them. But at last one of them said, "Hark! I believe it is raining. I certainly hear the falling drops." The others laughed and told him that it seldom rained when the sun was shining. But as they listened, they plainly heard the tinkling of many drops falling through the forest and sliding from leaf to leaf until they reached the bramble bushes beside them, when, to their great dismay, they found that the raindrops were melted rubies, which hardened on the leaves and turned them to bright crimson in a moment. Then, looking more closely at the trees around, they saw that the treasure was all melting away, and that much of it was already spread over the leaves of the oak trees and maples, which were shining with their gorgeous dress of gold and bronze and crimson and emerald. It was very beautiful, but the idle fairies were too much frightened at the mischief their disobedience had caused to admire the beauty of the forest, and at once tried to hide themselves among the bushes, lest King Frost should come and punish them. Their fears were well-founded, for their long absence had alarmed the king, and he had started out to look for his tardy servants. And just as they were all hidden, he came slowly along, looking on all sides for the fairies. Of course, he soon noticed the brightness of the leaves, and discovered the cause, too, when he caught sight of the broken jars and vases from which the melted treasure was still dropping. And when he came to the nut trees and saw the shells left by the idle fairies and all the traces of their frolic, he knew exactly how they had acted, and that they had disobeyed him by playing and loitering on their way through the woods. King Frost frowned and looked very angry at first, and his fairies trembled for fear and cowered still lower in their hiding places. But just then 2 little children came dancing through the wood, and though they did not see King Frost or the fairies, they saw the beautiful color of the leaves and laughed with delight and began picking great bunches to take to their mothers. "The leaves are as pretty as flowers," said they, and they called the golden leaves buttercups and the red ones roses, and were very happy as they went singing through the wood. Their pleasure charmed away King Frost's anger, and he too began to admire the painted trees. And at last he said to himself, "My treasures are not wasted if they make little children happy. I will not be offended at my idle, thoughtless fairies, for they have taught me a new way of doing good." When the Frost Fairies heard these words, they crept one by one from their corner, and kneeling down before their master, confessed their fault and asked his pardon. He frowned upon them for a while and scolded them too, but he soon relented and said he would forgive them this time, and would only punish them by making them carry more treasure to the forest and hide it in the trees until all the leaves, with Mr. Sun's help, were covered with gold and ruby coats. Then the fairies thanked him for his forgiveness and promised to work very hard to please him, and the good-natured king took them all up in his arms and carried them safely home to his palace. From that time, I suppose, it has been part of Jack Frost's work to paint the trees with the glowing colors we see in the autumn, and if they are not covered with gold and precious stones, I do not know how he makes them so bright. Do you? Birdie started as his mother finished her story with this question, for he had been listening so intently that he had almost forgotten where he was. But soon he laughed and said, "I guess Jack Frost must have lots of gold to paint all the trees, and I think he's very good to make the woods so pretty." Just then Birdie's father came in and asked him what he was talking about, and the little boy tried to tell him the wonderful story of the Frost Fairies, but needed some help from Mamma to make it plain. His father said that it was a funny story, but added, "I think, Birdie, you ought not to stay in the house to hear fairy stories this fine weather. You know you will soon be 5 years old, and must try to grow large and tall by being out in the fresh air. How would you like to take a drive with me this afternoon and bring Grandma back to pay us a visit?" The child's eyes sparkled as he replied, "Oh, Papa, I'd love to go, and if I have a party on my birthday, Grandma could see it." So they made their arrangements, and after dinner, Birdie was wrapped up warmly and lifted into the carriage by his father, and they started on their journey. The day was bright and clear, and Birdie enjoyed the ride very much, especially when they came to the woods and he saw their beautiful dress of yellow, crimson, and brown. "Oh, Papa," said he, "see how Jack Frost has painted all the trees. I wish I could take some to Mamma." His kind father then stopped and gathered a large bunch of the pretty leaves for Birdie, who was delighted with his treasures and admired them all the way to Grandma's. When they reached the cottage, Grandma was very glad to see them and hurried Birdie in to get a good look at him, the look ending in a warm kiss on his rosy face. Then they told their errand, and Grandma said she would go with pleasure if they could wait until she got ready. After she left the room, the maid brought in a tray of bread and butter, clear honey, and rich milk, which Birdie and his father found very good. and soon afterwards Grandma was ready, and they started for home. As soon as the carriage stopped, Birdie climbed out to give Mamma the bunch of autumn leaves. She thanked him for bringing them and said they were beautiful. Then they had tea, and Birdie was soon nodding, in a funny way, on Grandma's knee, which reminded his mother that he must go to bed early after his long ride. And kissing them all, good little Birdie ran upstairs with Nancy, and in 5 minutes was far away in dreamland. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chelsea Cabico. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. The Fountain Fairies. Dear children, have you ever had a birthday party? If you have, you can imagine Birdie's delight as his 5th birthday drew near, and how very anxiously he counted the days in his own peculiar way, saying each morning, "Now one more sleep is gone, and then today has to go, and another sleep, and then pretty soon my birthday will come." His kind mother had written little notes of invitation to his cousins and friends, telling them when to come to the birthday party. And in due time, the answers came by mail, with stamps on and everything, just like grown-up letters, Birdie said. And each of the letters contained the good news of the little writer accepting with pleasure Master Birdie's polite invitation for Thursday afternoon. At last all the sleeps were gone but one, and the very next day would be the one for the party. There were such wonderful doings in the kitchen that Birdie was quite puzzled, and wanted to know why they were making such a lot of puddin's. But his mother and Nancy, who seemed very much interested, told him he had better stay in the dining room, and not ask too many questions. And as he began to think they were making goodies for his party, he went out of the kitchen very good-naturedly. As everyone seemed so busy, he at last concluded to help Mamma by putting his toy closet in order. "For," he said to his kitten, "the children will want to see my toys, of course." So he cleared out the closet completely, making a heap of toys in the middle of the room, and then proceeded to brush and dust the shelves and floor with his little broom, sweeping all the dust and rubbish out on the carpet, intending to take it up in a dustpan, like Nancy, when he had finished his cleaning. After this he dusted his toys and arranged them very carefully in his closet, ready for his little visitors to see. His picture books, box of building blocks, and large Noah's Ark were placed in full view, as certain to please, but he had serious doubts about leaving a headless horse, a one-armed drummer, and a doll without a nose in such good company, until he thought they had better be left, because there mightn't be enough of toys for all the children, and then he could play with the broken ones. This decision he imparted to his grandmother, who just then came into the room and sat down by the fire with her work. She smiled kindly and said, "That is right, Birdie. Always give the best to your friends, and try to make others happy, and then everyone will love you." "Yes'm," answered Birdie, with one of his wise little nods. "I'm going to do that way, all the time." Then he went back to his work, and soon finished putting away the rest of his toys, and exclaimed, "Now, Grandma, my closet is all ready for the party. Please come and see how nice it looks, with your spectacles on," he added, as his grandmother laid down her sewing to comply with his request. He had a funny idea that people who used spectacles could not see at all without them, and as he wanted his clean closet to be seen, he thought Grandma ought to wear her spectacles. So the kind old lady came, with her spectacles on, and looked carefully at the little boy's closet. and pleased him very much by saying she thought it was very nicely fixed, and she couldn't see a speck of dust, even through her glasses. "But what is to be done with all this dust and dirt on Mamma's carpet?" she asked, looking at the rubbish Birdie had swept out on the floor. "Oh, I just forgot about that," cried the child, looking quite ashamed of his neglect. "I'll take it all away in a milk pan." He meant a dustpan, of course, and hurried into the kitchen to ask Nancy for one. But, making the same mistake in the name, Nancy said, "Sure, and it's the tasing boy ye are, the day, and niver a bit of milk pan can ye have, at all, at all." But Grandma came to the rescue, and explained that Birdie only wanted a dustpan for a little while, which made Nancy laugh as she brought it to him, saying, "Och, but you're a queer boy, not to know a dustpan from a milk pan." Birdie laughed too, but ran back to the dining room to try and get the dust taken away before Grandma, who had stopped to speak to his mamma, came back. But this was harder work than he supposed, for it seemed to him as if he could not catch the dust. No sooner did he collect it in a heap and try to brush it into the dustpan than puff! It would fly away as if it were bewitched, and he would have all his sweeping to do over again. And the more he hurried and the harder he brushed, the more the dust and rubbish flew and danced about, until there was quite a little whirlwind all around him. He was getting quite tired and worried when his grandmother came back, and seeing his flushed face, asked what was the matter. "Why, I'm trying to get this dust into my pan, Grandma," said he, "but it won't go in at all. Just see." And he bent over the heap of dirt he had once more collected, and raising his broom high in the air, he brought it down with all his might, giving the dirt a quick, hard push, which had the effect of scattering it again in all directions, leaving the dustpan as empty as at first. "Oh, you sweep too roughly, my little man," said his grandmother cheerfully. "We can often do more by working gently and patiently than by such hard work." Then taking the broom, she swept the scattered heap together and brushed it quietly and slowly into the dustpan, which soon became full, while the carpet began to look bright and clean under the steady strokes of the little broom. "There, Birdie," said she, as she finished, and put the broom away. "Now the troublesome dust is disposed of by gentle and persevering work. There's a saying that you ought to remember. Gentleness is better than force, and I hope your troubles today will help you to think of it sometimes, when you feel like being rough and rude, or angry at not succeeding in your work or play." Birdie was now sitting on his grandma's knee to rest, and after saying "Yes'm" to this good advice, sat very still, looking at the fire and thinking, until, with a long sigh, he said, "I've nothing to play with, for I don't want to stir my books or playthings till I'm 5 years old. I wish somebody would tell me a story. Can't you tell me one, Grandma?" he added, looking up archly. "I 'spect you know some stories, and I would like to hear one." His grandmother smiled at his request, and said she did not remember many stories now, for it had been a long time since her boys were little enough to listen to them. "But I will try and tell you one, Birdie, to make you remember to be gentle, if I can think of it," she concluded, and then sat still a little while, thinking. But Birdie waited patiently, for he was delighted at the prospect of hearing a new story. At last Grandma began by saying, "I think I can tell you a story that you will understand if you listen attentively. It is called The Fountain Fairies." Long, long ago, in the days when giants and fairies lived upon the earth, there was a lovely fountain in a great shady forest. Its waters were as clear as crystal, and served for a mirror where the forest trees, the ferns, and wildflowers might look in and see their own sweet faces. The gentle deer and timid hare often came there to drink of the cool waters, and would start away when they saw bright eyes looking up at them from below. But finding out at last that it was but their own shadow, they would satisfy their thirst, and then rest on the soft green moss beneath the spreading trees, and listen dreamily to the murmur of the water. From the fountain a little stream flowed out among the grass and fern, and danced along merrily over white pebbles and shining sand, seeking the sunlight beyond the wood, and singing as it went. A band of fairies dwelt near this fountain, although scarcely ever seen by any mortal, for by day they hid themselves in the hollow trees, or under the arching fern leaves, or among the mossy rocks of the old wood. And it was only at night that they came from their hiding places, to visit the fountain and the stream they loved, and to bathe and sport in the clear waters, or dance in fairy rings upon its bank. Here they spread their tiny supper upon a flat rock, so covered with fine moss that it looked as if a soft cloth of green velvet were over it. And while the wisest among them arranged the acorn cups and saucers, and placed the ripe berries properly on the plates of green leaves, the younger ones were sent to gather all the honey they could find in the flowers, and to catch the falling spray from the fountain, in the beautiful pitchers of striped green and brown, which they borrowed from Jack in the pulpit, a neighbor of theirs. And so each had their part to do in furnishing the fairy feast. Dearly did the fairies love their fountain, and often they sang its praises in sweet verse, which sounded like the music of its rippling waves. And not only did they love and praise it, but they watched over it, and tried to keep from it all that might hurt or defile it, carrying far away the falling leaves and twigs that might have blown into it, and watering the flowers and grass around it with dewdrops on warm days, so that it was always fresh and green and beautiful around that clear fountain. They knew the little stream that ran among the pebbles was longing in its heart to grow large and strong, and go traveling through the meadows towards the great blue sea, where it could see the ships, and they tried, in their gentle loving way, to help it, and sometimes brought great leaves filled with dew to pour into its channel, or coaxed other little streams to wander towards it, and join it on its pilgrimage, so that the stream from the fountain was fast growing deeper and stronger, and pushing farther on its way to the sea. But the fairies were so fond of it that they rejoiced to see its happy smile as it went wandering on, waving good-bye to them, and only said, "When you are a great river, dear stream, do not forget your friends, the Fountain Fairies." One day something very sad happened to the fountain. A great noise was heard at a distance in the forest, a sound of trampling and brushing, with cracking of twigs and the fall of breaking branches, as if some great wild animal were coming through the trees. The lovely fairies, who had been floating around their dear fountain, busy with their work of watching over it, were frightened at the strange sound, and hid themselves in the hollow trees and among the ferns and rocks. In a few moments the sounds came nearer, and the fairies, peeping out, saw a fierce-looking giant striding angrily along, striking at the harmless trees and bushes with his knotted club as he came. On his back he carried a huge buffalo, which he had killed in the chase, and when he reached the grassy bank of the fountain, he drew his burden upon the ground and bent down to drink of the clear, cool waters. Tired and thirsty from his long journey, he drew in deep draughts of the delicious water, and was rising to go on his way, when he caught sight of his own face, with the dark and angry frown it always wore, looking up at him from the depths of the fountain. Without stopping to think that it was but a reflected image of himself, he flew into a rage, and seeming to imagine that the spring was to blame for what he saw within it, he began tearing up rocks and stones, and dashing them into the fountain with great violence, until he had filled and choked up the spring, so that the clear waters were covered with rocks and earth, and could no longer be seen or heard. Then, throwing the buffalo across his shoulders, he rushed away, growling and muttering crossly, towards his gloomy cavern in the distant mountains. The fairies remained hidden for a long time, trembling with fear, and listening in silent dread lest the terrible giant should return. But at last they crept timidly forth, and came with noiseless tread to the brink of the spring. When they saw how their beloved fountain was ruined, from being filled with rocks and choked with mud and earth, and when they found they could no longer see their sweet faces in its clear waters, nor drink of its silvery spray, and when they saw the little stream withering away, and hiding itself low down among the grass, as if in sorrow, then their grief broke forth in sobs and tears, and they sat down upon the bank to mourn the loss of their favorite friend and their merry playmate. Long did they sit there weeping, their tears flowing over the green moss unheeded, while the trees and shrubs above them sighed and murmured sadly, and the night birds cried mournfully from time to time. But suddenly a wise old fairy, who had been carefully examining the rocks within the ruined spring, by the light of his glow-worm lantern, sprang hastily upon the shore, and waving his pointed cap around his head, shouted, "Silence!" In a moment all sounds were hushed, as the fairies looked up in surprise, for there was a note of joy in the old fairy's voice. "There's yet hope," continued he. "Your tears have worn a channel in the trodden ground, and are flowing towards our spring, and dripping slowly through the stones into the fountain. Spend no more time in weeping, but hasten to collect all the dew from tree, and plant, and flower, and bring your offering hither. The giant's evil work may yet be overcome by patient, loving toil." When the Fountain Fairies heard these words, they sprang up joyfully and shouted and danced with delight. Then, crowding around the wise old fairy, they learned the best way to carry out his plans, and hastened away through the forest to seek for dew and raindrops. Very earnestly they toiled for many days and nights. They searched for the bright drops of dew in every flower cup and leaf, and gathering as much as they could carry in their fairy goblets and urns, they hastened to the ruined spring, and poured the tiny sparkling streams over the rocks and among the stones that covered its bed. For a long time it seemed as if their toil were useless, except to save the trampled ferns and wildflowers on the bank from perishing, for they revived under the fairies' care, and became more green and beautiful than at first. Still the love and hope felt by the fairies kept them from despairing, and they toiled on patiently. The great oak trees and the graceful birches and maples that grew above the spring watched the work with great interest, and whenever a shower came dropping down upon them, they would shake their leafy heads and wave their long green mantles until every drop of rain was shaken off and sent rolling down from leaf to leaf to find its way to the fountain, and help to fill its silent basin. Indeed, some of the little trees thought that the old oak tree, which was so tall it seemed almost to touch the sky, had told the clouds about the poor spring, and asked them to send the cool showers over the forest very often, to help in the good work. But the oak tree, when questioned, always answered gruffly, or pelted the little trees with acorns, and so they never could find out exactly how it happened that so many showers came by that summer. At last the patient, gentle work of the fairies was rewarded. The water began to rise once more in the fountain, and to bubble through the crevices between the stones, with a sound like low, sweet laughter. And ere long it began to dash and leap over the rocks, and seek the little streamlet's long silent way, to wander happily among the ferns and grass as of old. Great was the joy of the good fairies to find their dear fountain restored to its former beauty. Indeed, some said it was more beautiful than ever, for it danced over the rocks so merrily, and its waves were so bright and flashing in the sunlight, that it pleased them better than the calm stillness of its first life. The trees and flowers, the birds and butterflies, all seemed to rejoice with the fairies, and drew lovingly around the fountain. And as to the ferns and mosses, they were so glad to see the bright waters once more, that they climbed bravely over the rough rocks, almost hiding them with their velvet mantles, that they might draw closer to the spring and feel its cool kisses on their heads. Thus the wicked work of the great giant was overcome by the patient love of the little fairies, and instead of the fountain being filled up and ruined, it became more bright and beautiful than before, making all around it happy with its cheerful music. And the little stream that wandered from its shore went merrily on its way, ever growing larger and stronger, until it reached the sea and saw the white-sailed ships. But I believe it never forgot the gentle Fountain Fairies. When the story was ended, Birdie sat so still on his grandma's knee that she thought he must have fallen asleep after his hard work of cleaning house. And so she did not say anything for a while, but presently he raised his head and said, "I think that's a very sorrowful story, Grandma, about that naughty giant throwing stones into the pretty spring. I hope he'll never come to our woods and spoil the little brook that way." The little boy said this so earnestly and looked so anxious that his father, who had been in the room a while, began to laugh at his fears, saying, "Why, my boy, there are no giants now, you know. Grandma only wants to show you that ill temper and impatience are like ugly, rough giants, who harm and destroy this beautiful world, and make all around them unhappy. And just as the giants were once small and weak children, so these wrong tempers begin by little naughty ways and cross words, and if they are not kept down and conquered, will grow to be fierce and strong, like the wicked giant in the story. I hope my little boy will try to keep down these wrong feelings, and never let them grow large and strong, for that would make us all very unhappy," concluded the kind father, as he lifted Birdie in his arms and kissed him. "No, Papa," said the child, clasping his hands around his father's neck. "When I feel cross, I'll just say to Mr. Temper, 'You better be quiet, or I'll put a stone on your head to keep you from growing.' That's what you say to me sometimes," he added, with a merry laugh. His father and grandmother laughed too, at the child's funny thought, and when Birdie had thanked Grandma for her story, he and his papa went out on the porch to take a little walk until dinner time. End of section 9 of the Fountain Fairies.
Section 10 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dawn Sutton. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. Birdie's Birthday Party. On the morning of his birthday, Birdie slept soundly, and did not awake until his mother was dressed, when he opened his eyes to find her bending over him, saying, "This is your birthday, darling. I wish you many returns of it." Then she gave him 5 kisses, one for each year that he had been her own dear little son. Birdie thought this a very pleasant way of counting his age, and returned it by giving his mother 5 big hugs, one for every year that she had taken care of him, and been his own dearest, bestest mamma. Then he sat up in bed and looked around for the blue dress and white apron he had worn the day before, intending to show his mother that he could dress himself entirely now. But he looked in vain for it, and when he said, "Where's my clothes, Mamma?" his mother held up a cunning little suit of boy's clothes and said, "Your dress seems to be gone, Birdie, and this is in its place. I wonder who could have made such a mistake. Shall I ask Nancy to look for your dress downstairs?" Birdie looked earnestly at the pretty plaid jacket with a white ruffle on the neck and bright gold buttons, and at the real pantaloons fastened to it, and hastened to answer his mother by saying, "Oh, never mind about that old dress, Mamma. Let me try on these clothes and see how they look," at the same time making such a dive at the tempting suit that he nearly went into it head foremost. His mother laughed heartily at his funny attempts to scramble into his new attire. Then she buttoned the jacket, pinned on a little bow for a cravat, and said, "Now stand still, and let me see whether I know this little boy or not." Birdie straightened up like a soldier, and stood still while his mother walked around him, surveying the new suit with a look of great satisfaction, and saying to herself, "They could not fit better. How cunning he looks!" ending the survey by pulling up his stockings and pulling down his pantaloons, which came just below the knee. Then, seeing the important look on Birdie's face, she said, "I wonder who that little boy is. I used to have a little boy, but he always wore dresses." In a moment the child ran to her, crying as he sprang into her arms, "I'm your little boy, Mamma. I'm only dressed in pants, 'cause I'm 5 years old. I'll wear dresses tomorrow if you want me to." The mother pressed the loving child to her heart and kissed his rosy lips again and again as she said, "Why, this is my darling Birdie after all. He always speaks kindly and tries to please Mamma." Then she added, "No, dear, you need not wear dresses any more, for you are old enough to be dressed like a boy, and it will be warmer for you. But if you continue to be good and gentle, and always try to be obedient, Mamma will not think she has lost her little Birdie, but will love her boy in pants as well as when he wore dresses." Birdie promised to be very good all the time, and then, with a hop, skip, and jump, proceeded to exhibit his new suit to Grandma and Nancy. He spent a quiet, happy morning with his toys and books. Grandma sat by the fire with her knitting and listened to all he had to tell her, and even asked him to bring his books and read to her. Accordingly, she was treated to the contents of Birdie's library, from the 3 Bears and Tom Thumb, all the way to the house that Jack built. Nothing could have pleased the little boy more than this, for as he knew them all by heart, he found it much easier to read in them than in the little lessons which Mamma kept in her work-basket, and Grandma was a much better listener than the kitten, which generally went to sleep before you finished one book, if she happened to be right side up, which was a rare event. After dinner, Birdie's mother took him upstairs to prepare for his guests. He felt very grand to have his clothes brushed, just as Papa did his, he said, and he waited with admiring eyes while his mamma dressed herself nicely and tied a pretty pink ribbon under her collar, in honor of the party. Whereupon Birdie smiled and nodded, saying, "This is the day. I guess the children will soon come." When they went down to the parlor, Birdie looked around and saw that the pretty autumn leaves he had brought were arranged in vases on the mantelpiece, with a few late flowers among them, and that some were hung over the looking-glass, and pictures making the room look bright and gay. His mother advised him, while he was waiting, to bring in his toys and books, saying she wanted the dining room for her company, and could not have the children running in and out. The moving was safely accomplished, and just as everything was ready, a carriage drove up to the door, and out jumped Aunt Lizzie and the children, as Birdie announced from his post at the window. They were soon in the parlor, and there was such a joyful meeting. Kisses and questions flew right and left, and Birdie was congratulated on his age and on his promotion to boys' clothes. His cousins, Willie and Harry, told him it was real jolly to have so many pockets to put things in, a remark Birdie soon found to be true, when Willie gave him a bag of marbles, Harry a top, and his aunt a nice bouncing ball, which were immediately stowed in the new pockets, until he looked like a balloon. Besides the boys, there was little Effie, a mischievous brownie with dancing black eyes, who said to Birdie, "I didn't bring you nothin' but a stick of candy, and I got so hungry I eat it up in the carriage. But I'll bring you somefin next time you're 5 years old." This comforting speech made them all laugh so heartily that poor little Effie ran away and hid her face in her mother's lap, and pretty golden-haired baby Alice began to cry at the noise, and could not be quieted until the noseless doll was given her to play with. The commotion was scarcely over when another carriage drove up with more little cousins, who soon found their way into the parlor and were warmly welcomed. Their nurse had brought them, and they could stay till 7, she said. Cheree was the eldest, and she had several messages. Being afraid she would forget them, she began, as soon as she got in, to say, "Mamma sent her love, Auntie, and we can stay till 7 o'clock, and please make us be good, and don't let us be too noisy, and I must not get my feet damp, and Johnny must not eat too much candy, and we can't put any in our pockets." At this the nurse looked at her reprovingly and said, "Your mother did not send that message, Miss Cheree," and everybody laughed when the little girl answered, "No, but Mamma said it all at the same time, and I've been saying it to myself all the way here, so I forgot when to stop." Johnny was Cheree's brother, a stout, rosy boy, a year younger than Birdie, and still wearing dresses, who seemed rather shy at such a crowd of children, especially when Lottie and May came too. Soon after, the big children came. There was Aunt Nellie, Alice Lee, a sweet, gentle girl, several years older than Birdie, but a great friend of his, and invited at his particular request. And with her were 2 more little cousins, Eddie and Elsie, whose bright eyes showed that they loved fun as well as anyone, although at first they were rather bashful and quiet. After the bustle of the arrival was over, Birdie's mamma told him to show his visitors his books and playthings, and left the room with Aunt Lizzie. The little boy felt rather confused, and did not know what to say, but his good-natured Aunt Nellie and Alice came to his aid, and proposed to the boys to build a block house and a train of cars, while they helped Cheree and little Effie to make a grand procession from Noah's Ark. Once interested in their games, they soon became sociable, and laughed and talked merrily together. After some time, the older ones grew tired of such quiet amusements, and Willie said, "What's the use of going to a party if you can't have some fun? Let's play Puss in the Corner." They all agreed to this, and hurried to their corners, leaving Alice Lee for Puss. She made a very good one, watching the corners and trying to get in, but always being a little too late, and there was no telling how long she would have been kept out had not little Johnny, who was looking on from his nurse's knee, suddenly rushed into the middle of the room, and seizing Harry, held him fast until Alice was safe in a corner. After this they played at being soldiers, and marched about the room with paper caps on, blowing trumpets, and beating drums made of tin cups, until the older ones were nearly deafened by the noise. Then they played Frog in the Sea and Hot Buttered Blue Beans, and had a splendid time, with funny interruptions now and then from Johnny, who would make a sudden charge into the midst of the game by way of helping, and then beat a hasty retreat, looking very bashful. While they were busy hiding the handkerchief, Birdie's mamma opened the door and said, "Hot buttered blue beans, please come to supper," and then told Birdie to give Alice Lee his hand and take her out to the dining room. The others followed 2 and 2, and Nurse and baby Alice brought up the rear. When they reached the next room, they all stood still, looking at the supper table. It was evidently meant only for little people, for at the head was a small tea set of blue and white china, and plates to match were placed around the sides, tempting little rolls, tiny pats of butter, and dainty slices of tongue, served for the substantial part of the meal, while pretty little glass dishes held honey and preserves, and others were filled with nuts, oranges, and sugar plums. But in the center was the crown of all, in the shape of a large cake, covered with white frosting, decorated with little flags, and surrounded by tiny colored wax candles and little candlesticks, making a ring of golden light, which shone on the rosy faces and bright eyes of the happy children. Baby Alice crowed and clapped her hands, and there were exclamations of, "Oh, how pretty! Isn't it lovely? And my, but that's jolly!" Birdie was too much pleased and surprised to do anything but look at the table, especially the cake, with his round blue eyes, and think how splendid it was to have a birthday party. His mother asked Alice Lee to pour out the tea, and placed her at the head of the table. Then, lifting Birdie into an armchair at the foot, she said, "You will have to be Papa, and keep all the rest in order." This made them all laugh, and as soon as they were in their places, they began to call him Papa, and asked to be helped to butter, and so on. He performed his duties very nicely, with an air of business that looked odd on his rosy face, and his father was much amused at the old head on young shoulders as he waited on his guests. Alice managed her department very well, and made such good tea that they all took 3 cups, which kept her busy, and at last emptied the teapot. For when she turned it up for herself, the lid was the only thing that went into her cup. Nancy hurried to her side, and snatching up the teapot, said, "Sure, Thin, it's a shame for you to have nothing but a lid for your tay. I'll get you more in a minute, for the tay kettle's as full as a fiddle." This speech was too much for Alice's gravity, and in spite of her important position, she indulged in such a merry laugh that she could hardly say thank you when Nancy returned with the teapot well filled. Then they all had some honey and small cakes, and after that came the great event of cutting the large cake. The candles were almost burnt out, so they were removed, and the cake was placed before Birdie, his mamma saying, "Now you had better cut your cake, dear." And he looked quite frightened at this new undertaking and said, "Oh, you do it, mamma." his mother gave him a large knife and said, "Make the first cut, and I will do the rest." So he stuck the knife in, and then watched his kind mamma as she divided the cake, giving each of the children a slice. They were not long in tasting it and finding out that it was good as it looked. Then Grandma, aunties, and Papa all had a slice, and said it was a very fine cake. Even the baby stretched out her little hands for a slice, and when her mamma gave her some, said, "Goo, goo." At last, when all the good things had been enjoyed and some nuts and candies packed in each little pocket with Aunt Nellie's help for tomorrow, the children went back to their games while the older guests took tea, and then joined the merry group in the parlor. Grandma advised them to keep quiet a while for fear they might take cold on the way home from being overheated. Birdie at once thought of his favorite quiet amusement, storytelling, and said, "Do tell us a story, Grandma, and we'll all be as quiet as mouses." The other children joined in this request until Grandma could not refuse, and after they were all seated, told them the story of the Fountain Fairies, or the Giant and the Spring, as Birdie called it, which pleased them all very much. Then Aunt Lizzie said she must gather up her chicks and be off, and there followed a busy scene of wrapping up the little ones and saying goodbye. They all kissed Birdie and said they had had a splendid time, and little Effie said, "I wish you had a birthday party every day," to which Birdie replied, "I wish so too, Effie." Lottie and May, with Eddie and Elsie, stayed a while longer and became very good friends. And Eddie said he was going to ask them all to his birthday party when next May came, and they'd have lots of fun. At last they all drove away, and the tired but happy little boy climbed to Grandma's knee for a rest and said, "Did you have a nice time, Grandma?" "Yes, dear. I love to see good children playing together, and you and your cousins were all so gentle and kind that your party was very pleasant, even to me," replied the grandmother. Birdie smiled joyfully, put up his mouth for a kiss, then nestled down to think about it, as he said. But he was soon fast asleep, and was carried off to bed by Nancy to dream of all the pleasures of his long talked of birthday party. End of section 10.
Section 11
of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ashley Strickland. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby.
Section 11
Part 2nd. When Birdie and his father came home, they found Mama and Grandmama sitting by a bright fire with their sewing, both looking so warm and comfortable that they could hardly believe it was bitter cold out of doors. But when they felt Birdie's cold hands and saw his purple cheeks, and found that it was hard work for him to keep back the tears, they began to rub his hands and try to cheer him up. His mother said his cheeks looked as if the cross Winter Fairies had been pinching them, and that perhaps they were angry at him for having a nice sleigh ride over the snow while they had to fly about in the cold. And Birdie soon began to smile like a brave boy and say he didn't mind the bad fairies, hardly a bit. Grandma said his cheeks were like frozen peaches and almost too cold for her to kiss. But for all that, she took him on her knee and kissed him many times, until he was quite warm again. Then she said, "It is a splendid snow for Santa Claus and his sleigh full of toys to come on. In a few more days he will be here." and this made Birdie ask a dozen questions about Santa Claus, which patient Grandma answered pleasantly. And when his mother told him to go play with his toys, Grandma said, "I will read you tonight a story of a little boy, Birdie, who took a ride with Santa Claus. That is, if you are good all day." Birdie tried to be very good, and when evening came, his grandma read aloud the story called A Ride with Santa Claus. One snowy day, a little boy named Fred, with bright blue eyes, red cheeks, and curly head, was hopping round the room among his toys, his new boots making lots of jolly noise. And he was singing, "Christmas soon will come, and Santa Claus will bring a ball or drum." His kind old nurse smiled at his childish glee, and taking him upon her apron knee, said, "Let me tell you, Freddie, what I've heard. If any child will watch without a word, and catch Saint Nick at work on Christmas Day, he's bound to take him riding in his sleigh." The blue eyes danced with wonder and delight as Freddie questioned, "Will he come tonight?" And being answered, "In a day or two," he trotted off to think what he should do. And nurse, glad of the quiet, dozed again, unwitting of the mischief set in train. On Christmas Eve the stockings all were hung around the chimney. Christmas hymns were sung. And then the little ones were tucked in bed and went to sleep, all but the monkey Fred. His eyes were open wide and watchful kept, until quite certain that his brother slept. Then slipping from his bed by slow degrees, he gained the hearth rug, crawling on his knees. And putting on his clothes in silent haste, his skating cap upon his head he placed, and stretched himself close to the chimney wide, to watch for Santa Claus and claim a ride. The time passed on, and soon Fred was aware of jingling sleigh bells in the upper air. Then close beside him old Chris seemed to stand, filling the stockings with a liberal hand. Fred laughed with joy, and merrily he cried, "I have caught you, Chris! Now let me have a ride!" No sooner said than done. They seemed to rise, and found upon the roof, 'neath starry skies, a sleigh packed full of toys and drawn by deer, who pranced and pawed to see a stranger near. "Now jump in, Fred, and bundle up your knees," said Santa Claus, "unless you want to freeze." Strange sights saw Fred upon that Christmas ride. At some he laughed, at some he almost cried. The rich man's home was pleasant to behold, stored well with every comfort bought by gold. And Santa Claus, while there, seemed growing hot, in hunting something that those boys had not. Each warm sock filled, a Christmas tree was decked. Old Santa sang, "Soon 'twill all be wrecked." With comic sorrow, then away they sped, to where the wind was howling round a shed. And snow was drifting in the shaking door. Fred ne'er had seen such wretchedness before. Within, 5 children huddled in a heap, with tear-stained faces, shivered in their sleep. No stockings hung upon the chimney nail, no tree was there, but in a broken pail a spray of ivy bore a note which said, "Dear Santa Claus, please bring us some bread." A tear in Chris's eye found resting place, and Freddie's fist crept very near his face, till roused to action by this scene of woe, he whispered to his leader soft and low, Give them the toys and candy meant for me, and let us dress them up a Christmas tree." Then Santa Claus gave him a loving look, and from the sleigh brought top and ball and book, and heaped the table with a goodly load of Christmas cheer. The ruddy apples glowed, a turkey plump upheld a huge mince pie, and in the fireplace wood was piled up high. Fred's joy was great to see this pleasant sight. He gave a shout when suddenly 'twas night. He was at home and lying on the floor, and nurse was coming in the open door. He sprang in bed and held his frightened breath, while nurse said, "Child, you'll surely catch your death." No word spoke Fred of all that he had seen, only Mamma the wondrous tale could glean. But when he said, "Please let me give some toys and candies to the widow Thompson boys," she gave consent, while to herself she sighed, "'Twere well if all with Santa Claus could ride." A few days after this, Grandma went home. But before she left, she gave Birdie a copy of the verses about Santa Claus, and he persuaded his mother to read them so often that he learned them himself, and could soon repeat them very nicely.
End of section 11.
Of Birdie and his fairy friends.
Section 12 of Birdie and his Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. The Winter Fairies. The Winter Fairies. One morning, when little Birdie opened his eyes and looked towards the window, he was surprised to see the trees before the house all stripped of their bright leaves, and covered with white feathers, as he thought. He jumped out of bed and trotted to the window, in nightdress and bare feet, to look out with wide blue eyes at this new wonder that had come to pass. The feathers seemed to hang like wreaths on the brown trees, and the grass beneath was thickly strewn with them. And Birdie saw pretty soft things floating about in the air, so that he was highly delighted. But he had not been there for very long when his mother called him back to bed, before Jack Frost pinched his little bare toes. The boy ran back and cuddled down in his bed, which seemed very warm and comfortable. But still, he wondered what happened in the night to make such a change out of doors. At last he said, "Mamma, what time did you go to sleep last night?" "At the usual time, dear," answered his mamma. "But why do you ask?" "Why, somebody has taken all the leaves off the trees and dressed them up in white feathers," said Birdie. "And maybe you saw who did it 'fore you went to sleep, mamma?" His mother raised her head and looked out at the trees, and then said, "Yes, King Winter has been here." "Did King Winter do that, mamma?" cried Birdie. "Oh, do tell me how he hangs the feathers on those high trees. He must have a very long ladder." Then his mother said, laughing, "Oh, I see what you want. You are on the watch for a fairy story. Well, I will tell you a short one while the room gets warm." The little boy was pleased to hear this, and gave his dear mamma a shower of kisses, for thank you. and then begged her to go on with the story. So she began. King Winter lives in a very strong palace near the cold North Pole. It is built of great blocks of thick ice, and all around it stand high, pointed icebergs. And cross white bears keep guard at the gate. He has many little fairy servants to do his bidding, and they are like their master, cross and spiteful, and seldom do any kind actions, so that few are found to love them. But he keeps all his wealth so tightly locked up that it does no one any good. And, what is worse, he often tries to get the treasure of other persons to add to the store in his money chest. One day, when this selfish old king was walking through the wood, he saw the leaves thickly covered with gold and precious stones, which had been showered upon them by King Frost, to make the trees more beautiful, and to give pleasure to all who saw them. But looking at them did not satisfy King Winter. He wanted to have the gold for his own, and made up his mind to get it somehow. And back he went to his palace to call his servants home for this new work. As soon as he reached the gate, he blew a loud, shrill note on his horn, and in a few minutes his odd little fairies came flying in at the windows and the doors, and stood before him, quietly waiting to hear his commands. The king ordered some to go out in the forest at nightfall, armed with canes and clubs, and to beat off all the golden and ruby leaves. Then he told others to take strong bags and gather up all the treasure and bring it to him. "If that silly King Frost doesn't think any more of gold and precious stone than to waste them on trees, I will teach him better," said the old king. The fairies promised to obey him, and as soon as night came, off they all rushed to the forest, and a terrible noise they made, flying from one beautiful tree to another, banging and beating the leaves off. Branches were cracking and falling on all sides, and leaves flying about, while the sound of shouting, laughing, and screaming told all who heard it that the spiteful Winter Fairies were at some mischief. The other fairies followed and gathered up the poor shattered leaves, cramming them roughly into the great bags they had brought, and taking them to King Winter's palace as fast as they were filled. This work kept up nearly all night, and when morning came, the magic forest of many-colored leaves was changed into a dreary place. Bare trees stretched their long branches around and seemed to shiver in the cold wind, and to sigh for the beautiful dress of shining leaves so rudely torn from them. When little Birdie heard this, he was almost ready to cry and said, "I don't like that Winter man. He's naughty. But I'll give the poor trees my red dress to keep them warm." His mother said he was a good boy, and she would tell him how naughty King Winter was disappointed. "You will soon be laughing again when you hear what happened, my pet." Then Birdie was satisfied, and his mother went on. King Winter was very much pleased, as one great sack after another was tugged in by the fairies. And when morning came, he called his servants together and said, "You have all worked well, my friends, and have saved much treasure from being wasted. I will now open these bags and show you the gold, giving you each a share for yourselves." The king then took up the nearest sack to him and turned it upside down, gave it a shake. The fairies looked on eagerly. But what was their surprise when out rushed a great heap of brown leaves, which flew all over the floor and half choked them with dust. When the king saw this, he growled with rage and looked at the fairies with a dark frown on his face. They begged him to look at the next sack, but when he did so, it too was found full of brown leaves instead of gold and precious stone. This was too much for King Winter's patience. He tossed the bags one by one out of the palace windows, and would have tossed the unlucky fairies after them, had not some of the bravest ones knelt down and asked for mercy, telling him they obeyed his orders, and if King Frost had taken back his treasure, they were not to blame. This turned their master's anger against King Frost, and very angry and fierce he was. He gnashed his great teeth with rage and rushed up and down in his palace until it shook again. At last he made up his mind to go out that night, break down King Frost's beautiful palace, and take away all his riches. Just see, Birdie, how he went from one wicked thing to another. He began by wishing for what belonged to someone else, and at last willing to fight and steal to get it. I hope my little boy will always be satisfied with his own toys and books, and never wish for or try to get other children's. Birdie promised he would never do such a bad behavior, which was a favorite expression of his, and then asked to hear more of the story. Well, when night came, King Winter started out with all his fairies. Some were armed with the clubs they'd beaten off the leaves with, and others had lumps of ice to throw at their enemies. But the king had been so angry all day that he had not told them what to do, and had left their sharp spears locked up. He wrapped himself in his great white cloak of swan's down, that he might look very grand, and so they went on their way. King Frost lived on the other side of the wood, and he had heard all the noise made by the Winter Fairies in spoiling the trees, and had seen the next morning the mischief they had done. It made him very sorry to find the beautiful leaves all knocked off and taken away, and he determined to punish King Winter for his mean and wicked conduct by going to attack his palace that very night. He spent the day making ready for battle, dressing himself and his servants in shining coats of ice armor, and giving each one several spears and darts of ice tipped with sharp diamond points, so that they looked like brave little soldiers. The two armies met in the midst of the great wood, and after some words between the kings, their servants fell to blows, and a great battle they had. The Winter Fairies fought with their clubs and threw balls of ice at their enemies. But their clubs were weak from being used so roughly the night before, and soon broke. And when their ice balls were all thrown away, they could find no more. But King Frost had armed his servants well, and they threw their sharp darts among the Winter Fairies, and dashed at them with their spears, wounding a great many. The trees, too, seemed to fight against the cruel fairies. The bare twigs pulled their hair and scratched their eyes. The branches tripped them up and thumped them well whenever they could. So the Winter Fairies had the worst of it, as those who fight in a bad cause always do. And at last they started off, full speed, and rushed through the wood, never stopping, till they got back to their palace and shut themselves in, leaving their king, who was too proud to run, all alone with his enemies. You may be sure they were not very merciful. They all rushed at the mean old fellow at once. Some threw darts at him, others tripped him up, and a host of the little things began to pull at his cloak, screaming out, "Give us your cloak to keep our trees warm! You stole their pretty leaves, and you must give us your cloak!" Now this was a magic cloak, and had been given to King Winter by the Queen of the Fairies. So, when he felt his enemies pulling at it, he wrapped it tightly around him and began to run. After him flew his foes, pulling and plucking at his great white cloak, snatching out a bit here and there, laughing and shouting while King Winter howled and roared. And he rushed along, not knowing where he went. On they flew, up and down the wood, in and out among the trees, their way marked by scattered bits of white down from the king's cloak. It was not until day began to dawn that King Winter found himself near his own palace, when, in despair, he dashed his tattered cloak to the ground and rushed through the gate, shaking his fist at King Frost, though speechless with rage. The brave Frost Fairies took the cloak as a prize, and as they went home through the wood, they hung beautiful wreaths of white down on all the trees, and placed upon the branches their broken spears and darts, which shone like silver in the sunlight, and made the wood look almost as bright as before it had been robbed of its golden and ruby leaves. Even the ground was covered with shining darts and white feathers, and everyone thought it was very beautiful and very wonderful, and could not tell how it had happened. The people must have heard the noise of the battle and the shrill screams of the fairies as they followed King Winter to and fro. But I suppose they thought it was only the wind blowing and whistling through the trees, for I never knew anyone who watched this wonderful battle except the one who told me all about it. "Oh, who told you, Mamma? How did you hear it all?" cried Birdie very earnestly. "Oh, a little bird told me," his mother answered, smiling, "and I thought you would like to hear it. But now we must not talk any longer, dear, but must hurry, to be ready in time for breakfast, and afterwards we can take a look at the white feathers on the grass and see if they will make you a cloak." "I don't believe they will," replied Birdie, "but they might do to make a cushion for my little chair." And sure enough, after breakfast, Birdie brought in a pan full of feathers and tried to shape them into a cushion for his armchair, and was very much surprised to find them all run away until he only had a panful of water left. Just then, however, his father came in to take him out for a sleigh ride, and he was soon well wrapped up and packed in among the buffalo robes, and looked very happy as he rode off, with the bells jingling merrily and the horse prancing gaily along. End of section 12. The Winter Fairies.
Section 13 of Birdie and His Fairy Friends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carla Simon. Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby. The Christmas Fairies. As Christmas drew near, Birdie had many questions to ask about it, for it was the first Christmas Day he could remember, and he wanted to know whether Kris Kringle would surely come in a little sleigh and fill his stocking. One day he trotted over the house, upstairs and down, looking at all the chimney places to see if they were large enough for Kris Kringle to come down. He was afraid they were all too small, and told his mother so, with a very sad face. But she sent him to look at the kitchen chimney, which was so wide and high that he was delighted, and ran to his mother saying, "Oh, Mama, Kris can come down the kitchen chimney and bring a great big pack of toys." That evening, little Birdie climbed up on his mother's knee and begged for a story before he went to bed. "Don't you know something about fairies who come at Christmas, Mama?" he said roguishly. His mother kissed his red lips and said she would tell him a short story because he had been a very good boy all day. So she began. Once upon a time, all the children in the world had been so good that Kris Kringle had more work to do than he could well manage. He had lots of toys to buy and a great many trees to dress, and then he had to go to every house the night before Christmas and fill every stocking. So the dear old man thought he would be quite tired out, unless he could get some help. But one cold day, about a week before Christmas, as he was working away at some trees, he heard a little knock low down on his door. And when he opened it, who do you think he saw? "I don't know," said Birdie. "Who was it?" Why, it was a little man dressed all in brown and only a foot high, and behind him were a great troop of little fellows just like him. Kris Kringle was greatly surprised at this sight and stared at his strange visitor without saying a word. But the little man did not mind that in the least. Off came his pointed cap, and with a low bow he said,
"How do you do, Mr. Kris Kringle? We have come to help you do the work this Christmas."
"Oh, indeed," said Kris Kringle. "You are very kind, my friends. Come in, and let us have a talk about it." Then he led the little people into his house, but there was such a troop of them that he had not chairs for all, and was going to bring in some more seats when they said,
"Don't trouble yourself, Mr. Kris. We can easily find room."
And then some sat on the backs of the chairs, and some climbed up and sat in the trees Kris Kringle had been fixing for Christmas, while a few spread out their cloaks and seemed to fly up to the high mantel shelf, where they sat in a row, laughing and nodding and looking very comical. When they were all quiet and Kris Kringle had seated himself in his armchair and taken his pipe, the leader of the fairies, who was on the mantel shelf, said,
"Now, Mr. Kris, what can we do for you?"
Then he went on to say,
"We have put the flowers to sleep for the winter and wrapped up the leaves in warm coats until spring. And we are tired of living underground and counting gold dust or playing pitch and toss with diamonds, so we want to go with you and see the world."
And the funny little man made a very droll face and danced a few steps of the Highland Fling on the mantelpiece. Kris Kringle laughed aloud at his antics, and said, "Well, friend, I shall be glad of help if you will promise to obey me." He then told them of all there was to be done, and said if they would be industrious and help him dress all the trees and tie up toys and sugar plums, he would take them out in his sleigh the night before Christmas, and they could help him fill the stockings. When the fairies heard this, they were very much pleased, and tossed up their caps and shouted,
"Hurrah for Kris Kringle! He's a jolly old elf!"
And all agreed to work hard to get ready for Christmas. And so they did, and I've heard that the trees were very beautiful that year, and the stockings very well filled. It was really wonderful too, how many good children found a bright gold piece in the toe of their stockings. And what do you suppose the naughty ones found? A hard turnip or a big potato, just when they thought they had an orange or an apple. "The fairies are very wise, you know, my child," said Birdie's mamma. And the little boy nodded and answered,
"Yes, indeed they are so, but I will try to be good and then they won't put potatoes in my stocking." Then our little friend gave his kind mamma a good-night kiss and trotted off to bed, talking all the way about the fairies. The next day was the one before Christmas, and Birdie tried to be a very good boy. His goodness was to obey his mother quickly, to be kind to the cat, and not to get angry if his blocks or toys fell down. Well, on this day he tried very hard to be good, and succeeded so well that at dusk his mamma said she would have to tell Kris Kringle about it. So she took Birdie by the hand, led him out to the kitchen, and called up the chimney. "Kris Kringle! Birdie has been very good. Please bring him some pretty toys in your sleigh." "And a tree," said Birdie as loud as he could. Soon they heard a gruff voice saying, "Yes, Mom. Yes, sir. I'll remember, Birdie." And then there was a sound of sleigh bells as if Kris had been listening to Birdie and was going on again. This rather surprised the little boy, but Nancy told him Kris Kringle often went to different houses to see if the children there had been good before he came with the toys. Then Birdie and his mother went back to the parlour, and as he climbed up to his favourite seat on his dear mamma's knee, she said, "Now we can have a nice talk until bedtime." "Oh, yes," said the child. "Let's talk about Christmas." "Very well, dear. I will tell you why we have a Christmas Day. Many years ago, there was no such day. The little children did not hang up their stockings or find pretty trees by their beds when they awoke," the mother said gently. "How funny!" exclaimed Birdie. "I am glad I was not here then. How did they find out about it, Mamma?" "Listen, and you shall hear about the first Christmas. It was in a country across the sea, far away from here, that some shepherds were watching their flocks one night. The sheep were resting on the grass, the little lambs were fast asleep beside their mothers, but the kind shepherds were not asleep, but were watching that no harm should come to the sheep. Perhaps they were looking at the stars and talking of the happy land above them, when suddenly there appeared a wonderful light in the sky, brighter than moon or stars, as if the sky had opened, and they saw the glory within. While the shepherds looked up, wondering what was the cause of that strange light, a beautiful shining angel came near them and said, "Fear not, I bring you good tidings," or good news, "which shall be to all people. This day is born a Saviour, and ye shall find the babe lying in a manger." And suddenly the angel was joined by a multitude of the heavenly host, singing praises to God. This was their song. "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." When the angels were gone back to heaven, the shepherds said they would go to Bethlehem and see this Saviour of whom the angels sang. They went with haste and found him, a little babe in a stable with no cradle to lie in, only a manger for his bed. That little babe was Jesus, the Son of God, who left his beautiful heavenly home and the praises of angels and became a child to bless and save little children and make all men good and happy, so that at last they might be in heaven with him. His birthday was the first Christmas Day, and ever since that time we keep that day as a joyful and happy one, and send gifts to one another to remind us of the great and precious gift of Jesus. When his mother had finished this true story, little Birdie sat still for a while thinking, but soon he looked up and asked if Jesus had any Christmas gifts. "No, my child," said his mamma. "Jesus came as a poor babe. His mother loved him, but she was very poor and had nothing to give him." "I would give him some of my Christmas gifts," said Birdie, "if he was here now." "Well, dear, you can still do that, and I wish you would," said his mother earnestly. "Why, how, Mamma?" exclaimed the little boy, looking very much puzzled. "I can't get up to the sky to take them. Even if I stood on the top of a big high tree, I don't think I could touch the sky." "No, darling, I don't think you could," answered his mamma, smiling kindly. "But when our Saviour went back to heaven,
He left the poor on earth for us to take care of, and said any kindness done to them was the same as doing it to him. So if you will give some of your Christmas gifts to the poor children at the lodge, it will please Jesus as much as if you gave him something."
"Well, I will," said Birdie. "Let's tell the childrens to come here tomorrow and not tell them what for. And when they see the tree, and I give them all some toys to keep, won't they be surprised?"
And the happy child laughed as he thought of the poor children's surprise and pleasure. Then Birdie's mamma sang him some Christmas hymns, which are no doubt well known to my little friends. One hymn was "While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night," which Birdie could understand better now after hearing the story of the first Christmas day. Another hymn, or carol rather, was "We Three Kings of Orient Are," and another was "Christmas Hymn for Children." "Sing, ye children, sweetly sing, welcome to your infant King. This the season, this the hour, when he left his state and power. For a stable and a stall, stooping low to save us all. Sing, ye children, sweetly sing, welcome to your infant King. Coldly blows the frosty blast, winter binds the florets fast. Birds have fled the leafless spray, but our songs shall greet his day. In his house shall living green blend with berries' coral sheen, making summer while we sing, welcome to our infant King. Day of gladness, day of mirth, when we hail the Saviour's birth, and he looks with loving smile on our homage all the while. Every blessing of our land flows from that once baby hand. Then let little children sing, welcome to our infant King. By the time these hymns were finished, Birdie was so sleepy that he could not wait to see his papa, who had not yet come in. But taking a nice bowl of bread and milk by the parlour fire, he went off to bed early to give Kris Kringle plenty of time to fill his stocking very full, way up to the top. Christmas morning came very soon to the little boy, for he slept soundly and was ready to awake at the first peep of day. And what do you think was the first thing he did? "Why, he looked for his stocking, I think," says little Bright Eyes. Yes, to be sure he did, and soon found it hanging at the foot of his bed, but it had grown so long and heavy that he could hardly lift it. At last he dragged it up to his pillow, sat himself down, and began pulling out the toys with which it was filled. First came a whip, then a nice large ball, next a doll, for he liked dolls, though he was a boy. After that he found 3 or 4 picture books with brightly coloured plates, which Birdie stopped to look at with delight. Then a horn of sugar plums, a dear little hammer, and down in the foot of this wonderful stocking, a rosy apple, an orange, and a red silk purse with a gold penny in it. By this time his shouts of joy had aroused his mother, who looked at all his treasures with him, and said she thought Kris Kringle had been very kind to her little boy.
"And the fairies too," exclaimed Birdie. "Look at this!"
And he held up the purse with the gold piece shining through it.
"But I didn't find any taters in my stocking, so I guess the fairies like me, Mama. And I like them, and old Kris Kringle too," added Birdie, hugging his full stocking in his arms, for while he had been talking, his mother had helped him to put his toys in again. Then the kind mother dressed her happy child in a warm new suit of blue cloth, with "lots of gold buttons," Birdie said, telling him that it was her Christmas gift to him.
and soon afterwards they went down to breakfast, the stocking with its load of toys hanging from Birdie's hand and going bump bump as it followed him down the stairs. They found Papa waiting for them before a blazing wood fire, and he wished Birdie a Merry Christmas and gave him a toss and a dozen kisses, and then everything in that stocking was shown to Papa, who seemed so much surprised that Birdie was delighted, and said, "Don't you wish you were a little boy to get your stocking full?" After breakfast they all went into the parlour, and there on the table stood the prettiest Christmas tree. Its branches were hung with shining toys, bright red apples, cakes and candies, golden nuts, flags, and everything pretty. In fact, it was just like the one you will find in your parlour next Christmas, little Blue Eyes, if you are a very good child all the year. When Birdie saw it, he danced for joy and ran all around the tree, looking at the wonderful fruit that grew upon it, and saying,
"Oh, I'm so glad Kris Kringle bought me one of his trees. I was afraid he'd forget it."
At the foot of the tree he saw a new large Noah's Ark, a strong wooden cart, a new box of blocks, a tin horse, and some more beautiful large picture books. And after a while he discovered a doll with a box of wooden furniture beside her. His blue eyes grew larger and brighter than ever at each new sight, and presently he said,
"All these pretty things for me, Mama? I think Kris Kringle must have upset his sleigh down our big chimney."
"He has brought you a great many toys, dear," replied his mother, "but perhaps he thinks you will not keep them all yourself. Do you remember what you said last night about giving some toys to the children at the lodge?"
"Oh, surely enough," exclaimed Birdie. "I wish those children would come."
Just then there was a knock at the door. Birdie ran to open it, and there stood 3 little children. They had clean red and white faces and clean blue and white aprons, and they began to say, "Merry Christmas, Mom," but were so pleased and surprised when they saw the beautiful tree that they could not finish their greetings. They could only look at all the pretty toys and smile with delight. But Birdie did not let them stand still very long. He led them up to the tree and took them all around it, showing them the playthings on it and talking as fast as he could. Then he showed them everything in his stocking and asked if Kris Kringle had filled theirs. Mary, the eldest girl, said they had hung up their stockings and found candy and apples in them, but no toys. And Susan added rather sadly, "Mother says our chimney is too little for the pack of toys to come down." Then Birdie ran to his mamma and whispered,
"You tell him Kris brought some toys here for him."
"Very well, darling," was the reply, and going to the tree, Birdie's mother took the doll and gave it to Mary, and put the box of furniture into Susan's hand, saying, "Kris Kringle bought these for you and left them here. Our chimney is so large he had plenty of room for his bundle of toys." The little girls looked very much pleased and said,
"Thank you, ma'am. They're mighty pretty."
Then Birdie said,
"Now give Johnny something nice, Mama,"
at the same time pulling the shy little boy towards the tree. "Shall I give him this cart, Birdie?" asked his father, holding up the strong wooden one. Now Birdie had long wished for just such a cart, or a spress wagon, as he called it, and would rather have given away something else. But just then his mother whispered, "It is the same as giving to Jesus, my child." So he said,
"Yes, Papa, give it to Johnny."
His father handed it to the little boy, who was too much delighted to say anything, but who began at once to draw the cart slowly along the floor and to play horse for it. Birdie gave a little sigh, but felt glad to see Johnny so happy and was taking up his new whip to play driver, when his father said, "Where is that gold dollar of yours, my boy?"
"Here it is, Papa,"
answered Birdie, pulling the purse out of his pocket. "Now," continued his father, "you are such a generous little boy. You would like to give these children a piece of this gold dollar, would you not?"
"Why, yes, I would," said the child earnestly, "if I could only break it. My new hammer is strong. I'll just run and get it."
And he turned away to look for his hammer. But his father called him back, saying, "See here, I've broken it for you." And when Birdie looked on the table, he saw a row of 4 shining silver pieces where he had left his gold one. "There is a piece for each of you," said his father. But Birdie was very much puzzled and could not understand how his gold penny was broken into 4 such large, bright silver pennies, and after thinking it over for some time said,
"I guess you must be a great big fairy, Papa."
Then he gave a silver penny to each of the children and put the last one into his little red purse, and felt very rich as he stowed it away in his pocket. The little visitors stayed to dinner and had a splendid play with Birdie's toys, both new and old, and enjoyed their Christmas dinner of roast turkey, mince pie, and other goodies very much, and then went home carrying a basket full of treasures. One more wonderful thing happened on Birdie's Christmas Day. When they went into the parlour after dinner, there, under the tree, stood another strong wooden cart exactly like Johnny's. In it was a paper on which was written, "Kris Kringle sends this to a generous little boy." Birdie was surprised and delighted and said, "Kris was the goodest man in the whole world." And then he ran to the kitchen chimney and shouted up, "Thank you, kind Mr. Kris, for all my nice toys." "You're very welcome. I like good boys," answered a gruff voice. So you see, dear little readers, that Birdie had a Merry Christmas because he was good and generous, and wishing you all the same, Birdie will now bid you goodbye. The end. End of Birdie and His Fairy Friends by Margaret Canby.